In the latter part of the summer of 2010, a man by the name of Ben McDaniel, who was 30 years old, was attempting to begin his life anew. On the surface, it might have appeared that everything was well. He was following a brand new and interesting activity when he was living in the sunny panhandle of Florida. Ben, on the other hand, was bearing a significant burden underneath. His hometown was Collierville, Tennessee, and it was there that he had established a prosperous construction company using his own two hands. He took great pride in it. However, when the housing market collapsed in 2008, his company went out of business, and it went out of business rather badly. In the end, he was left with nothing but debt, and a significant amount of it, amounting to almost $50,000. An individual who had given everything he had into his work was dealt a devastating blow by this. However, the financial loss was not even the most significant aspect of the situation. Before that, Ben had suffered the loss of his younger brother Paul a couple of years earlier. Due to the fact that Paul had suffered a stroke, Ben and his parents were left in utter disarray after his passing. Paul, on the other hand, was the more careful and grounded sibling, whereas Ben had always been the one who took risks and was the most adventurous. Ben's life was profoundly altered by the loss of him, and he had a difficult time coping with the pain that he felt. Shelby and Patty, his parents, watched as their surviving son drifted off into the distance. Despite the fact that he was depressed and disoriented, he was searching for something, anything, to satisfy his emptiness. His marriage had also ended in divorce, which was simply another aspect of his previous life that had disintegrated beyond repair. As a result, Ben came to the conclusion that he needed a significant shift. He relocated to Ponce de Leon, Florida, leaving behind his life in Tennessee, or what was remained of it, and brought his belongings with him. Scuba diving was the new hobby that he had discovered, and it was something that appeared to make him feel like he had a purpose once more. More specifically, he felt compelled to go to a location known as Vortex Spring. It is a lovely natural spring that produces a wide pool before feeding into a massive underwater cave system, making it a popular location for divers to visit. Ben was completely committed. He hired a tiny trailer on the property that was owned by the owner of the spring, and he committed himself entirely to exploring the underwater world. Within a relatively short period of time, he was able to move his certifications from open water diver to more advanced certification. He became certified extremely quickly. Nearly every single day, he would be found there, swimming in the crystal clear water that was refreshing. Ben saw the undersea environment as a means of making his escape. At that point, it appeared as though the burden of his financial obligations and his sorrow simply vanished. He was able to simply be there because it was a serene and placid location. However, a few of the other divers who were part of the close-knit society that existed at Vortex Spring saw something else in Ben. They observed a man who was going too far and moving too quickly with things. Cavern diving is widely considered to be among the most hazardous sports in the world. Having an extraordinary amount of patience, precise planning, and a profound regard for the harsh environment are all necessary components. Cave divers with years of experience, and often even decades of experience, spent developing their skills. On the other hand, Ben appeared to be in a hurry most of the time. It was his goal to dominate the cave, to go further and deeper than anyone else had ever gone before. It was said that he had a cowboyish presence, and even that he was haughty. It is said that he expressed a desire to find a way to pass through a particularly tight and perilous restriction deep into the cave, which was a location that experienced explorers had believed to be inaccessible. The thought of exploring new areas of the cave and establishing a reputation for himself was something that he was entirely preoccupied with. Some of his close friends and family members were concerned that he was not taking the risks seriously enough, and that his desire to change his identity was causing him to act in a risky manner. As the sun began to set on the 18th of August 2010, Ben prepared himself for yet another dive. There were lengthy shadows cast across the sea as the sun was about to set. As he made his way to the end of the pier, the heavy gear he was carrying rumbled with each step he took. He wore his mask around his neck, his tanks were on his back, and he was holding his fins in his hand. The act was something that he had performed 100 times before. After a few period of gazing out over the lake, he quickly pulled his mask over his face, placed his regulator in his mouth, and then walked off the edge, sinking beneath the surface with a splash. The entrance to the cave was a dark maw at the bottom of the spring basin, perhaps 50 feet below the surface. He was moving in that direction. The light from his headlamp cut a beam through the blue water as he fell through the water without any difficulty. As soon as he reached the entryway, he continued on his way into the darkness. In the field of cave diving, the initial explanation put out to explain what took place after that was straightforward and sadly common. It was around 7:30 that evening that the staff at the Vortex Spring Diving Shop, a guy called Chuck Cronin and the owner's son, Lowell Kelly, reported seeing Ben enter the dive shop for his dive. They were aware that he was a devoted diver who frequently went in by himself. They did not instantly get concerned when he did not come to the surface after a few hours had passed. It is possible that divers, particularly those who are investigating the cave, could be down for an extended period of time. However, as the night progressed and there was still no trace of him, a stoic concern started to develop underneath the surface. The next day, when he still hadn't come up, that worry grew into genuine terror due to the circumstance. At that moment, his truck was still parked in the lot. There was only his dog in his trailer by himself. The situation was not right. At the same time as the authorities were contacted, a search operation was initiated. Once the Walton County Sheriff's Office arrived, it was immediately apparent to everyone that the initial assumption was correct. It was discovered that Ben McDaniel, a diver with a relatively low level of experience who was notorious for testing his limits, had entered a hazardous underwater cave and had not emerged from it. There must have been some kind of mishap. In one of the cave's winding side channels, he might have become disoriented and lost his way. It was possible for him to become trapped in a restrictive situation. It's possible that his apparatus broke down. It's possible that he went out of breath. The cave had a reputation for being a murderer. One of the signs that was placed close to the entrance was a gloomy warning to divers about the dangers that they faced. It was a stark reminder of the many other people who had died in its depths throughout the years. The narrative appeared to be written by itself. The cave had taken another victim, and this time it was Ben McDaniel. In the context of this particular sport, it was a tragedy, but it was a risk that was acknowledged. Instead of being a rescue mission, the mission was now a recovery mission. In order to locate his body, they were going inside. The search for Ben McDaniel was a massive effort that was fraught with a great deal of vulnerability. Finding a body in a setting that is simply open water is already a challenging task. There is a completely different level of difficulty involved in locating one within a cave system that is flooded, such as Vortex Spring. There are a number of narrow channels that wind their way through the cave. The floor is coated in a fine silt that has the consistency of talcum powder. Even the slightest touch from a hand or a fin can cause a cloud of this silt to be kicked up, which can reduce visibility to zero in a matter of seconds. It is referred to as a silt out, and it is one of the worst nightmares that a cave diver may experience. It is possible to become utterly bewildered, to the point where you are unable to see your hand in front of your face and to locate the guideline that will bring you back to a secure location. As a result of these dangers, the sheriff's office was forced to bring in the most qualified individuals possible, cave rescue and recovery divers who are volunteers and have had extensive training. They were individuals who willingly went into locations where other people had passed away, putting their own lives in danger in order to provide a family with some sense of closure. It was on August 20th, 2 days after Ben was last seen, that the first teams entered the building. They proceeded in accordance with the primary guideline that could be found in the cave's most often visited areas. As they searched every nook and cranny, their strong lights penetrating the murky water, they looked for any indication that Ben may be present. A person, a piece of equipment, a fin, a mask, or anything else may have been what they were looking for. And still, they discovered nothing. A peculiar and unnerving pattern started to emerge as the first day of seeking moved into a second, and then a third, as the 3 days of searching continued. All traces of Ben McDaniel were completely absent from the scene. As they progressed deeper into the cave system, the divers entered the more hazardous areas of the cave. After that, they headed to the location where it was said that Ben was preoccupied with discovering a new tunnel. Every single dead end and every single small compartment was investigated. Nothing has changed. Certainly, this was not the norm. It is extremely simple to locate the deceased in the vast majority of cave diving accidents that result in fatalities. The majority of the time, they are discovered with all of their gear on, entangled in the guideline, or constrained by a restriction. The cave has a way of retaining its victims. However, in this particular instance, the cave appeared to be devoid of any inhabitants. An odd discovery was uncovered after a couple of days had passed since the beginning of the hunt. There was a discovery of 2 of Ben's diving tanks. On the other hand, they were not discovered far within the cave, which is where you would anticipate them to be if he had dropped them in the event of an emergency. They were discovered in the open water basin, which was located outside the entrance to the cave. The employee of the dive shop, Chuck Cronin, said that he discovered them. This was the first piece of information that did not appear to be consistent with the straightforward accident account. That 2 of his tanks were located outside of the cave is a mystery. It is common practice for divers to position stage bottles at specific points in order to retrieve them later for longer dives. Nevertheless, the positioning of these bottles was peculiar. The results did not appear to be consistent with any of the typical cave diving procedures. Despite the peculiar discovery, the search that was being conducted inside the cave continued. They were unrelenting in their pursuit. They looked on for several days. They went so far as to bring in specialized equipment in order to attempt to blast through a rock pile that was blocking a narrow tunnel that Ben had been interested in. They were under the impression that Ben had managed to pass through the obstruction and is now stuck on the other side. On the other hand, the endeavor was not only risky, but also ultimately failed. It was decided to call off the official search after nearly a week of intense, high-risk searching, during which more than a dozen professional divers searched every available inch of the cave. They had not discovered anything. Ben and his equipment were completely absent from the scene. It was said by the primary investigator for the sheriff's office that if Ben was indeed there in the cave, his body would be located in a section that was just inaccessible to rescue workers. According to the official record, it was thought that Ben McDaniel had drowned, and his body was reported to have been lost forever in the gloomy and silent depths of Vortex Spring. It was impossible for Shelby and Patty McDaniel, Ben's parents, to believe the official explanation that was provided and accepted it. It is incomprehensible that their son, along with all of his heavy diving equipment, including his tanks, his fins, his weight belt, and his lights, could suddenly disappear without a trace inside that cave. Quite simply, it was completely illogical. When it came to his dives, they were aware that their son was a risk-taker for sure, but they also knew that he was a thorough planner. He meticulously documented each and every dive that he went on. To them, the concept that he would simply vanish without a trace from their lives seemed illogical. Although they were experiencing a great deal of loss, they were also developing a strong sense of distrust. The sensation that they were not being told the complete story was something that they were unable to shake. They acted in the manner that any other parent would. They were not willing to give up. They secured the services of Kelly Fleischman, a well-known private investigator hailing from the state of Florida. In addition, they offered a hefty reward, which finally reached $30,000 for any information that could lead to the rescue of their son. The investigation into the case was initiated by Fleischman, who conducted more interviews with witnesses and examined the facts with a new perspective. And as she continued to look, the straightforward diving accident idea started to entirely disintegrate before her own sights. Not only did she discover a single problem in the narrative, but she discovered an entire string of them. The 2 air tanks that were discovered outside of the cave were the first major problem that needed to be addressed. An examination of the air carried within them was carried out. As it turned out, they were filled with the typical compressed air that is found in the atmosphere. The kind of deep, sophisticated cave diving that Ben was purportedly undertaking would have required him to use specialized gas combinations, such as nitrox or trimix, in order to avoid oxygen poisoning and nitrogen narcosis. Although Ben was known for his recklessness, it was highly doubtful that he would have made the rookie mistake of using plain air at the depths that he was purportedly exploring. This would have been an extremely dangerous situation. Even stranger was the fact that the tanks were found to be almost completely full. Just a little bit less air was contained within them than they would have been immediately after being filled. It was clear from this that Ben had only used them for a little period of time, if he had used them at all. What was the rationale behind him bringing 2 large tanks into the water, using them for a minute or two, and then leaving them outside the cave afterwards? Under any diving circumstance, it was completely illogical to do so. After that, Fleischman began investigating the employees of Vortex Spring, namely the 2 workers who were the last to see Ben and who were involved in the search for the tanks. These workers were Chuck Cronin and Lowell Kelly, the owner's son. It was the private investigator's opinion that their accounts were inconsistent with one another. It seemed as though their time frames of when they had last seen Ben and when they became aware that he was missing were slightly different from one another with each new account. It was hardly a conclusive piece of evidence, but it was sufficient to raise suspicions. In addition to this, Fleischman discovered some peculiar information regarding Ben's life around the time that he disappeared. He was in possession of 2 mobile phones. While he was in the parking lot, one was discovered in his truck. There was a lack of the other. The truck also had his wallet, which contained his identification as well as his credit card. If he was only going to go for a dive, we don't see why he would leave his wallet behind. The vast majority of individuals would keep it safe in their vehicle. It was discovered that his dog, a cherished companion that he kept with him everywhere he went, was locked inside his small trailer without any food or water. The fact that Ben would ignore his animal in such a manner, even for only one evening, appeared to be cruel and out-of-character behavior. In addition, the condition of his trailer was very questionable. At first glance, it appeared as though someone had tried to use it. Unfortunately, a few of his personal possessions were not found. Moreover, there was the issue of his diving logs to consider. The entry in Ben's journal for his final dive, which took place on August 18th, appeared to be incorrect. Ben was obsessed with keeping a log of his dives. Some others questioned whether or not the handwriting was even his. It was hasty and lacking in information, and it was not at all like his earlier entries that were extensive. It appeared as though it had been filled out by someone else in order to make a record of a dive that might not have actually taken place in the manner that it was portrayed. Despite the fact that the cave itself was intended to be the repository of all the answers, the cave itself was the source of the most significant flaw, the one that completely destroyed the official idea. Over the course of the subsequent couple of years, the McDaniel family supported a number of more private searches of the cave by spending their own personal funds. They had a strong desire to locate their son, or at the very least, to demonstrate that he was not present. Ed Sorensen, a man who is considered to be a legend in the world of cave diving, was hired by them in the year 2012. With his seemingly superhuman ability to traverse and explore the most perilous and tightest underwater caves on the world, Sorensen has earned a reputation for being an exceptional cave explorer. When nobody else is willing or able to go, people look to him as the person to go for recovery. In the history of Vortex Spring, Sorensen carried out one of the most extensive searches that have ever been completed. He remained in the cave for several days. He was able to circumvent constraints that were so tight that he had to remove his gear and squeeze through the openings on the side. Through his exploration of the cave system, he traveled further than any of the previous search parties had gone. He looked into every possible option, every rumor, and every lead that was available. His goal was to find any indication of a human body or any pieces of equipment. His conclusion was unquestionable and immovable, despite everything that had transpired. In a public statement, he asserted with complete and utter certainty that the body of Ben McDaniel was not found contained within the Vortex Spring cave. He stated that there was no physical method for a body to have entered the areas of the cave that had not been inspected, regardless of whether or not tools were present. In the event that Ben had passed away inside that cave, Ed Sorensen would have located him. He did not discover anything. A single remark made by an expert has completely altered everything. Could you please tell me where Ben was if he wasn't in the cave? There was no longer any basis for believing the claim of a terrible diving catastrophe. Another event had taken place on the 18th of August in the year 2010. Following Ed Sorensen's exhaustive investigation, which proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the accident explanation was not true, two new options emerged, each of which was more sinister and intricate than the one that came before it. In the course of the inquiry, which was now being led by Ben's family and their private investigator, an attempt was made to piece together what might have actually occurred on that particular evening. First, there was the possibility of some kind of criminal activity. Kelly Fleischman, a private investigator, came to the conclusion that Ben had been murdered and that his disappearance had been manufactured to appear as though it was an accident that occurred while he was diving. Putting this hypothesis back together, the reconstruction looks somewhat like this. The fact that Ben was not liked by everyone at Vortex Spring was something that had been established. A man who did not respect the established order in the community, he was perceived as being haughty. He was exerting a lot of effort in order to gain entry to the more hazardous and gated-off area of the cave, which was a privilege that was only granted to the most reliable and experienced divers. It's possible that he got into a disagreement with someone at the dive shop on that particular evening. Perhaps the dispute became more heated. It is possible that a confrontation takes happen in this situation, possibly on the pier or in close proximity to the ocean. The situation escalates into a physical confrontation, and Ben is either killed unintentionally or on purpose. The individual or individuals concerned are currently experiencing a state of panic. They are currently dealing with a deceased individual in a well-known tourist site. A cover narrative is required, and they need to get rid of it as soon as possible. And what could be a more fitting cover tale than an accident that occurred while cave diving at a well-known location? They are aware that if they are able to make it appear as though Ben was lost and perished in the cave, then it is possible that his body will never be located and no individuals will ask an excessive amount of questions. Therefore, they carry out their plan while doing so under the cover of darkness. They remove Ben's body and dispose of it in a location that is very far away from Vortex Spring, specifically a location where it will never be discovered again. Following that, they collect some of his diving equipment. For the purpose of giving the impression that he drove himself to the parking lot, they drive his truck there. They steal 2 of his tanks, which may have been the most convenient ones they could grab, which explains why they were filled with the incorrect kind of air. The tanks are dropped right beyond the entrance to the cave, generating a piece of evidence that is misleading. They walk down to the water and drop the tanks. To further their efforts to sell the tale, they may have even fabricated the final entry in his dive log. They then wait for a day and discover that Ben is missing, at which point they report him as a diver who has gone missing. Despite the fact that they are well aware that the cave will not provide any results, they focus the search in that direction. Each piece of evidence that lends credence to this viewpoint is convincing. The fact that Ben and his heavy gear were never discovered in the cave is explained by this explanation. It provides an explanation for the tanks that were put in an unusual manner and contained the incorrect air mixture. It provides an explanation for the inconsistencies that were stated by the staff of the dive shop, who the family feels were engaged in the incident. Lowell Kelly, the owner's son, has been singled out as the person on whom the family has placed the blame. Although they first brought a lawsuit against him for wrongful death, the case was eventually dismissed. They are of the opinion that he, along with possibly others, had a reason to harm Ben and the opportunity to cover it up. However, the local law enforcement has indicated that they have never discovered sufficient evidence to identify any suspects or treat the case as a homicide after they investigated the case. A very different picture of Ben McDaniel is painted by the second main theory, which is just as astonishing as the first major theory. The hypothesis of a staged disappearance is expressed in this way. Based on this reconstruction, it appears that Ben was not the victim of any kind of criminal activity, but rather the mastermind of his own disappearance. We are aware that Ben was during a very difficult period in his life. It was $50,000 worth of debt that he was drowning in. He was still in a state of mourning over the death of his brother. His company had been unsuccessful. He was feeling dejected and desperately looking for a way out, a new beginning. According to this scenario, Ben carefully planned to act as if he had already passed away. Because he was aware of the cave's reputation for being dangerous, he decided that Vortex Spring would be the ideal place. There is a possibility that disappearance could occur there. For several weeks or perhaps months leading up to the 18th of August, he worked on getting everything ready. It is possible that he was gradually removing the things that were most important to him from his trailer, things that he would require in order to start a new life. It's possible that he was putting money aside or developing a new identity at the time. A significant amount of cash was reportedly withdrawn from his account just before he disappeared, according to the reports. The strategy was put into action on the evening when he vanished without a trace. He puts on some of his gear and makes a show of going for a dive in order to make sure that the personnel at the business notice him. On the other hand, it's possible that he didn't even enter the water at all, or that he merely conducted a very brief dive that was shallow. It is a purposeful red herring, a piece of misleading evidence that he leaves behind the 2 air tanks in order to make the investigation more difficult to understand. After that, he sneaks out while it is still dark outside for shelter. The possibility exists that he has a getaway automobile hidden in a nearby location, or that he has an accomplice waiting to pick him up. In order to sell the story that he met his end in the spring, he abandons his truck, his wallet, and one of his phones, along with the rest of his belongings. He gives up his dog, which is a terrible reality, but an essential component of the strategy. In an instant, Ben McDaniel vanishes from existence, and a new individual emerges, liberated from the burden of debt and the anguish of a troubled history. Additionally, the data that supports this viewpoint is significant. He is experiencing severe mental and financial stress, which gives a great motivation. There is no physical evidence of a struggle or a body, which is a strong indicator that the crime in question is not a murder. It is more sanitary. Over the course of the years, there have been a number of unverified sightings of persons that resembled Ben in various regions of the country, and even in countries outside of the United States. A few days after he was said to have vanished, a waitress in a nearby town was convinced that she had given him breakfast. The theory is maintained by these sightings, despite the fact that none of them have ever been authenticated. It is a tantalizing possibility that Ben outwitted everyone and successfully started a new life, leaving his family to live in a state of uncertainty for the rest of their lives. While the investigation into Ben McDaniel's disappearance became less active during the years that followed, the mystery continued to grow more perplexing. In the official sense, it is still a case of a missing person. The year 2013 marked the year that Ben was officially pronounced dead, 3 years after he had been last seen. This permitted his parents to take care of his estate. Nevertheless, the legal pronouncement was of very little significance to them. The funeral was never held by them. In no way did they ever erect a headstone. In their hearts, they were unable to mourn the loss of a son whose future was still a total mystery. Both emotionally and financially, Shelby and Patty McDaniel were subjected to a mountain of hardship. They used their own money to pay for private detectives, prizes, and private search attempts, which totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. They exerted a great deal of effort in order to keep the case of their son in the public view, with the expectation that somebody, somewhere, would come forward with the piece of information that would eventually break the case open. They felt that the first investigation was bungled and that their suspicions of foul play were never taken seriously enough. As a result, they became extremely upset with the Walton County Sheriff's Office. The authorities, on the other hand, contended that they were unable to take any action because they did not have a body or any other tangible evidence related to the crime. The investigation was a frustrating mix of peculiar occurrences and theories that had not been examined in depth. In spite of the fact that they are at the core of the family's suspicions, the staff at Vortex Spring have always maintained their claims of innocence. They have not wavered from their narrative, which states that Ben was a careless diver who met a horrible end in the cave, regardless of whether or not his body was situated there. For years, they have been subjected to accusations on the internet and scrutiny from the general public, but no charges have ever been brought against them. The circumstances surrounding Ben McDaniel's disappearance continue to cast a pall over Vortex Spring, despite the fact that it continues to function as a popular diving hole. Ben's story has become a modern legend among the larger community of people who are interested in real crime and those who are divers. It has been discussed endlessly on internet forums and in films. There is a thorough examination of every aspect, including the tanks, the dive record, and the witness statements. The opinions of individuals are sharply divided amongst the three hypotheses. Was it a bizarre accident in which a corpse was lost in a manner that defies all logic and experience for the reason that it was lost? Could it have been a cold-blooded murder that was then covered up in a flawless manner? On the other hand, was it the most extreme kind of flight, a man who pretended to die in order to begin a new life? After everything is said and done, the case leaves us with a spooky silence. The truth about what took place at Vortex Spring on the 18th of August 2010 is nearly impossible to discern, despite the fact that the water there is completely transparent. It is only Ben McDaniel himself who is aware of the events that took place with absolute certainty. There is a possibility that his family will never receive the justice that they have battled so hard for if he was murdered. Those who murdered him may have been able to get away with the perfect crime. In addition, if he had fabricated his own disappearance, he would have left his parents in a painful state of limbo where they would be unable to grieve and would be unable to move on with their lives. During the time that they are locked in a nightmare of not knowing, they are left to worry each and every day whether or not their kid is still alive from somewhere in the world. Ben was meant to be able to escape through the cave, but in the end, it turned out to be a perpetual jail, not for his body, but for the truth and its contents. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comment section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? On the 18th of July 2019, a 28-year-old man named Andrew Harper carefully wrote a short note inside of a card. He folded it neatly, slid it into its envelope, and then handed it to a close friend who was standing nearby. With the envelope in hand and clear instructions from Andrew, the friend left the room and started walking down the long hallway. They were inside a place called the Ardington House, this beautiful historic mansion built way back in the 1700s. It sits on about 30 acres of gardens and parkland about an hour west of London, deep in the English countryside. Andrew's friend walked the length of the mansion, found the room he was looking for, and gave a gentle knock on the door. After being welcomed inside, he walked straight over to a 28-year-old woman named Lissy Beckett and handed her the envelope. Lissy and Andrew had grown up in the same small town of Wallingford. It was a quiet, rural place about 10 miles away from where they were now at the Ardington House. They had met each other when they were just 15 years old, and from that moment on, they had been completely inseparable. It was one of those rare cases of true love at first sight. And now, 13 years later, after all that time, they were finally getting married. So, Lissy took the envelope from the friend. She instantly recognized Andrew's handwriting on the outside, and a smile spread across her face. She carefully opened the letter and read the simple message inside. It just said, "Life is slippery. Here, take my hand." Now, on the surface, this little note just seemed like a sweet, romantic gesture from a man to his fiancée on their wedding day. But in reality, those 7 words perfectly captured who Andrew Harper really was. He was a protector. For as long as Lissy could remember, Andrew had always been deeply concerned with her safety, and really the safety of anyone and everyone around him. He just had this innate need to make sure that people were taken care of. As Andrew grew older, he also grew bigger. He ended up being a massive 6 foot 5 inch tall man, and this physical presence only amplified his natural instinct to protect others. He was known for being incredibly charming, friendly, and easy to talk to, but everyone who knew him also knew that in an instant he could flip a switch. He could use his big frame to step in and defend anybody who needed it, no questions asked. It was just who he was. So it came as no surprise to Lissy, or anyone else for that matter, when Andrew decided at the age of 19 to become a special constable. A special constable is basically a volunteer police officer. He joined the Thames Valley Police Department, which was the same department that looked after his and Lissy's hometown of Wallingford and all the surrounding areas. He was so good at it, so dedicated, that just 1 year later, the department hired him on full-time as a regular police constable. He was now a full-fledged police officer. Over the next several years, Andrew's work ethic and his genuine passion for the job made him one of the most well-respected and well-liked officers on the entire force. He wasn't just doing a job, he was living out his calling. In fact, just a few weeks before he sent that wedding day letter to Lissy, he had earned a major promotion. He was assigned to the Roads Policing Unit within the Thames Valley Police. This was a big deal. It meant a whole host of new responsibilities, but more importantly, it meant that Andrew would now be one of the first officers to respond to any emergency call that came in. He was on the front lines. Of course, this meant his job just became significantly more dangerous. He would be heading into unknown, high-stakes situations on a daily basis. But for Andrew, that didn't matter. The risk was secondary. To him, the most important thing in the world was protecting people who were in trouble. This promotion just gave him a bigger, better opportunity to do exactly that. So back at the Ardington House, Lissy read the note again. "Life is slippery. Here, take my hand." She set it down on the table, a huge grin on her face, and finished getting ready. A little while later that afternoon, she and Andrew walked down the aisle. In front of all their family and their closest friends, they said, "I do." And that evening, after the newlyweds shared their first dance as a married couple, they both told each other, without a doubt, that this was the happiest day of their lives. They had their whole future ahead of them, a future they had been dreaming of since they were teenagers. 28 days later, on the night of the 15th of August, 2019, Andrew was on duty. He was partnered with another officer who, coincidentally, was also named Andrew. His partner's name was Andrew Shaw. The two of them were conducting a surveillance operation in a town called Reading, which is about a 30-minute drive south of their hometown, Wallingford. Just after 11 p.m., they decided it was finally time to wrap it up and head for home. Officially, their shift had ended 4 hours earlier at 7 p.m. But Andrew and his partner were the kind of dedicated, hard-working officers who regularly put in overtime. They knew the extra hours would help their unit and their cases, so they did it without complaint. But now, at 11 p.m., they were both totally exhausted. As they were yawning and packing up their gear, Shaw, who was in the driver's seat, started the engine of their unmarked BMW police car. Once it was running, he pulled away from the curb, and they started heading north, back towards their home base. At that exact same time, not far from where Andrew and Shaw had just been, a very distressed man was on the phone with 999, the UK's emergency number. He was telling the dispatcher that just a few moments earlier, a gray sedan had pulled up his long driveway and stopped right outside of his property. This man lived on a road called Admore Lane. It was a narrow, winding, one-lane country road with very little traffic, especially at night. There weren't many houses out there, so for any car to turn onto his property would have been unusual. For one to do it in the middle of the night was instantly alarming. As soon as the man saw the headlights creeping up his driveway, he had gone to his window to watch. He was trying to figure out what was going on. Maybe they were lost? Maybe they'd turned into the wrong driveway and would just turn around and leave. But to his horror, that's not what happened. The car stopped right outside his house. The doors opened and 3 masked men got out. They were all carrying what looked like weapons of some kind. At that point, the man frantically dialed 999. As he was trying to explain the terrifying situation to the dispatcher, he was still looking out the window, and he suddenly realized what they were after. He told the dispatcher he thought they were there to steal his quad bike. The quad bike was parked right outside of his detached garage, and he could see the 3 men walking directly towards it. The dispatcher assured him that police were already on the way. But the man was getting more and more agitated. He told the dispatcher, "I can't wait any longer. I'm going out there to confront them and stop them from taking my bike." The dispatcher immediately told him not to, yelling at him to stay in the house, reminding him that the men had weapons. But he wasn't listening. He ran to his front door and threw it open. By the time he was looking outside, though, it was too late. The gray car, the 3 masked men, they were all gone. And so was his quad bike. He went back inside and got back on the phone with the dispatcher, who told him again, "Just stay at your house. The police are on the way. They'll intercept that car and they'll get your quad bike back." Seconds later, a call went out over the police radio. It was a dispatch for all Thames Valley police units in the area. The call was to intercept a gray car on Admore Lane. The dispatcher advised that the occupants were 3 masked men, that they were armed and should be considered dangerous. When Andrew and Shaw heard this call, they knew a couple of things. First, they knew they weren't the only officers who could have taken it. There were other units closer, other units on duty. Second, they knew they had been off the clock for 4.5 hours. There was absolutely no expectation for them to respond. They could have, and probably should have, just continued driving home. But they didn't hesitate for a second. When that call came over the radio, the only thing they thought about was doing their job. So, Shaw whipped the unmarked BMW around and sped towards Admore Lane. He turned off the main road, called the A4, and onto the narrow country lane heading north. As soon as they turned onto that road, their car effectively blocked the entire lane. There was no room for anyone to pass. At this point, they were fully expecting the gray car with the masked men to come driving towards them at any second. They were now the roadblock. Andrew and Shaw knew as soon as they turned onto that road that a close quarters confrontation was almost guaranteed. But if you listen to the dash cam footage from the front of their car, which picked up their voices, there's no hint of nerves. There's no fear, no hesitation in their conversation. They are calm, professional, and focused. This is what they had trained for. This is what they did. They were ready. So, Shaw is driving up this winding road. It's pitch black out. The trees on either side hang over the road, creating this dark tunnel effect. They're driving along, scanning the darkness ahead, and then all of a sudden, you can see it on the dashcam footage. A pair of headlights appears way off in the distance. And then, in a flash, that car comes bombing down the road right at them. Both cars slam on their brakes, and you can hear the loud screeching of tires on the pavement in the dashcam audio. The car in front of them comes to a full stop. Shaw stops too, but then he inches the BMW forward just a little bit more before stopping completely. Now the two cars are facing each other, maybe only 10 or 15 feet apart. It's important to remember that Shaw and Andrew's car was unmarked, and they had intentionally kept their blue police lights off as they drove up Admore Lane. They didn't want the suspects to see the flashing lights from a distance and have time to turn around and escape. So now, here they are, face to face in the dark. Andrew and Shaw are looking at the vehicle. They can see that it's a gray sedan, which matches the description of the car they're looking for. And behind the gray sedan, they can see what looks like a quad bike being towed. This is it. This is the car. There's no doubt in their minds. Shaw immediately flips on the blue emergency lights. Andrew, who's in the passenger seat, throws his door open and starts yelling at the occupants of the other car, ordering them to stay where they are. But the men in the gray car don't listen. They know they've been caught. There's a police car blocking their only way out. Their reaction is pure panic. Suddenly, one of the masked men in the back seat of the gray car leaps out of his door. He runs around to the back of their car and unhooks the quad bike. At the same time, the driver of the gray car, without even waiting for the third man to get back inside, just floors it. He tries to drive forward, going on to the left side of Shaw and Andrew's car, basically trying to squeeze past them even though there's nowhere to go but a deep ditch on the side of the road. But these guys are desperate. They're willing to do anything to get away. So the gray car lurches down into this ditch. It happens so fast that Andrew and Shaw can't do anything to stop it. At the same time, the third masked man, realizing he's about to be left behind, starts running around the right side of the police car, trying to circle around it the other way. And then, amazingly, just as this third man makes it around to the back of the police car, the gray car somehow manages to claw its way out of the ditch and get back onto the paved road. It starts speeding away from Shaw and Andrew. As it's driving away, the third man is just running down the road on foot, chasing after his own getaway car. Andrew sees this as an opportunity. He might be able to grab this third suspect who's out on foot, so he jumps out of the police car, turns, and starts sprinting down the road after them. Shaw is stuck. The road is too narrow for him to do a U-turn and drive after them. The only thing he can do is put the car in reverse, look over his shoulder, and start driving backwards down the road, trying to keep up. As Shaw is reversing, he can see the whole scene playing out through his rear window. He sees Andrew chasing the third masked man, who is in turn chasing the gray car. He's watching all of this unfold, and then something totally strange, something that seems to defy logic, happens. The third masked man suddenly leaps, as if he's trying to jump into the open window of the moving car. At the exact same moment, Andrew, who has closed the distance, kind of lunges forward to try and grab the man. And then, just as suddenly as it all happened, both men just vanish. They're gone. And the gray car just keeps driving and disappears into the darkness. Shaw is watching this, and he has no idea what he's just witnessed. He's thinking, where did Andrew go? Where did the third guy go? What just happened? But he's still in reverse, he can't stop, so he just keeps driving backwards, his eyes scanning the empty road behind him. Finally, he reaches a spot in the road that's just wide enough for him to turn the car around. As he's maneuvering the vehicle, you can hear a call come over the dispatch radio. Someone is asking Shaw for a status update, asking what's going on. All Shaw can say is, my partner Andrew has gotten out of the vehicle and I've lost him. I don't know where he is. After Shaw finally gets the car turned around, he starts driving forward back down the same creepy dark road. But now, there's nothing. It's eerily quiet. Andrew is nowhere to be found. The suspect's car is gone. The third masked man is gone. There's no one. Shaw is just driving down the road, hoping that around the next bend, he's going to see his partner running on the side of the road, or maybe find him walking back towards him. But he doesn't see anything. As he was driving, what Shaw didn't realize at first was that there were things on the road, small things that belonged to Andrew. He didn't see them in the dark, but the dashcam footage would later reveal an awful trail. First, there was his wallet, lying on the asphalt. Then, a little further down, his police badge. Then, his driver's license and other ID cards. Then, one of his gloves. Then, a piece of black plastic that looked like it had been ripped off of Andrew's tactical vest. A little farther down the road, as Shaw is still driving and scanning the darkness, he does notice something in his headlights. He stops the vehicle and gets out. The air is still and silent on this pitch-black road. He walks up to the object and sees that it's Andrew's stab vest, the protective vest he wore over his chest. He picks it up, walks back to his car, and puts it in the passenger seat where Andrew had just been sitting. At this point, you can hear over the radio, people are still asking Shaw, what's going on? And you can hear the panic rising in Shaw's voice as he reports back, I've found Andrew's stab vest. It was on the side of the road. He can't make any sense of it. He has no idea why it would be there. And dispatch doesn't know what to make of it either. So Shaw just gets back in the car and continues driving down that dark road, his mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, at the end of Admore Lane, where it connects back with the main road, the A4, two other Thames Valley police cars had arrived. They had gone to that intersection specifically to cut off the gray car as it fled. They were sitting there, waiting, and looking up Admore Lane when they saw headlights bombing towards them. It was the gray car. It came speeding out onto the A4, made a hard, screeching turn, and took off. One of the two police cars immediately took off in pursuit, chasing the gray car down the A4. But the other police car stayed right where it was. Because, unbelievably, they had just spotted Andrew. It turns out, when Shaw had first put the BMW in reverse and was watching the scene through his back window, what he saw was real. The third masked man had jumped towards the moving car, and he had successfully gotten inside. As for Andrew, the reason he suddenly vanished is truly horrific. The three masked men were 18-year-old Henry Long and two 17-year-olds, Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole. All three of them had extensive criminal records, even at their young age. They proudly called themselves career thieves, which basically just meant they spent their days and nights stealing from other people. That night, they had gone out with the specific intention of stealing that man's quad bike. It's not clear how they knew he had one, but they definitely came prepared. They knew they would have to get onto his property and tow the bike away very quickly before the homeowner had a chance to react. To do this, they had attached a long, very thick rope to the back of their gray car. It was basically a big loop of rope, almost like a lasso. When they pulled onto the man's property, they had backed their car up to the quad bike, looped that strap of rope over its handlebars, and then all three of them piled back into the car and sped off, dragging the bike behind them. But when they came face to face with Andrew and Shaw on Admore Lane, they panicked. The third man, Jesse Cole, was the one who hopped out of the car. He ran around to the back and unhooked the loop of rope from the quad bike, ditching it on the side of the road. This would make it easier for the gray car to make its getaway. Once the rope was free, the driver, Henry Long, took off without waiting for Jesse. So Jesse ran around the police car, caught up to the side of their now moving car, and leaped through the window. As soon as he was inside and Henry knew his friends were all back in the car, Henry hit the gas and accelerated hard. And standing there in the middle of all that chaos with both of his feet planted squarely inside of that loop of rope that was now dangling off the back of the gray car was Police Constable Andrew Harper. When the car suddenly accelerated, Andrew was violently swept off his feet. The rope cinched around his ankles and his legs. His head came back and smashed hard against the ground. And then he was dragged. He was dragged for 91 seconds at an average speed of 42.5 miles per hour down the entire length of Ardmore Lane. He was dragged for over a mile, whipping violently from side to side. He wasn't just being dragged along the ground, he was smashing into trees, into fence posts, into shrubs, anything and everything that lined that narrow country road. His body was being destroyed. It was only after they had dragged him for that entire mile that they finally reached the end of the road. When they pulled off Ardmore Lane and made that hard turn onto the A4, the centrifugal force of the turn swung Andrew's body around one last time. He smashed into a curb, which finally dislodged him from the rope and sent him careening into the middle of the road into oncoming traffic. At that exact moment, one of the two police cars that had been waiting there took off after the gray car in pursuit. But the officers in the other car, they saw Andrew. They saw him as he was thrown from the back of the speeding car and launched onto the A4. Initially, they actually thought the suspects were dragging a dead deer behind them. That's what it looked like from a distance, just a bloody, mangled carcass dangling behind the car. But when they ran up to see what it was, they realized with absolute horror that it was their colleague. It was Andrew. They immediately tried to save his life, performing CPR, doing everything they could. But Andrew's injuries were catastrophic. He had been torn apart. Andrew Harper died at 11:45 p.m. on the side of the A4, about 20 minutes after he and his partner had so selflessly decided to respond to that call, despite the fact they didn't have to. The three killers were arrested about an hour after Andrew died. A police helicopter had spotted their car hidden amongst some buildings about 4 miles away from where Andrew's body was found. During their trial, the three teenagers claimed that they had no idea that Andrew was attached to their tow rope as they sped down Ardmore Lane. They insisted it was a tragic accident. But the prosecution didn't buy it. They went out and meticulously recreated the exact scene that had played out. They used the same model of car, the same kind of tow rope, and a lifelike crash test dummy that was the same size and weight as Andrew Harper, 6'5" and around 200 pounds. They strapped the dummy to the back of the car in the same way Andrew had been caught, and they drove that same 1-mile stretch of road. The experts who conducted this recreation all said the same thing. It was nearly impossible to drive the car. As soon as the dummy would start to shift from one side to the other, it would tug and pull violently on the little gray car. Handling the car would have been a complete nightmare for the driver. Not only that, but the sound of Andrew's body grinding against the asphalt and smashing into trees and posts would have been extremely loud. The prosecution argued that there was absolutely no way that the three teens inside that car would not have known that a person was being dragged behind them. The prosecution also presented evidence that all along Ardmore Lane, they had found Andrew's blood on both sides of the road, high up in bushes and on trees. This indicated that the driver, Henry Long, must have been swerving violently from side to side as he drove. And according to the prosecution, the most likely reason for that was that he was trying to dislodge the person that was stuck on the back of his car. But the three teens never changed their story. They also never once said they were sorry for what happened. They showed absolutely no remorse. When the final verdict was read in court, they were found not guilty of murder. They were, however, found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. For them, this was a huge victory because the sentences for manslaughter were so much shorter. When that verdict came back, the three teens were seen punching the air, cheering, and laughing in the courtroom. They were making a complete spectacle of themselves. After being led out of the courthouse, with Andrew Harper's devastated family watching them, they were smirking and smiling for the news cameras, waving, and just treating the entire tragedy like it was one big joke. To this day, none of them have ever apologized or expressed any regret for what they did. In fact, two of the killers, Jesse and Albert, have since come out publicly and said they plan to write a book about the crime, about killing Andrew Harper. And there's no indication that this book is being written because they feel bad. It seems it's being written as an opportunity to make money from their crime. Following the verdict, Andrew's wife, Lissy, was completely devastated. She was shattered not only by the loss of her husband of just 4 weeks, but also by what she saw as a total injustice. The fact that these three had not been convicted of murder was something she could not accept. She channeled her grief into action. She went on to lobby for years to pass a brand new law in the UK, which she called Harper's Law. This law would mandate an automatic life sentence for any criminal who killed an emergency worker while in the process of committing a crime. The law would not differentiate between manslaughter or murder. If you killed an emergency worker during a crime, you would go to jail for life. And this year, Harper's Law was officially passed. However, the new law will have no effect on the sentences of Andrew Harper's killers, as laws cannot be applied retroactively. Henry Long was sentenced to 16 years in prison. The other two, Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole, were each sentenced to 13 years. All three of them will be eligible for parole by the time they are 28 years old, which is the exact same age that Andrew was when they took his life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In the year 2025, on June 29th, a woman by the name of June Baxter, who was 83 years old at the time, made her way slowly down the hallway of her simple home in Attleborough, which is a small town located in the eastern region of England. Her passing occurred at approximately 8:20 in the morning, according to the exact time. She suffered from a number of medical conditions that caused her to be rather fragile. As a result of these conditions, she was required to keep one hand on the wall in order to maintain her balance or stability while she was walking. For her to be able to walk, this was an essential requirement. Despite the difficulties she faced on a physical level, June placed a larger focus on her independence than she did on anything else. This was the case regardless of the circumstances. This was something that she was extremely excited to continue doing, despite the fact that her family believed that she was taking a little bit of a risk by continuing to live on her own in her own house. She was really eager to continue having this experience. During the time when June, her husband, and their cherished little puppy were all living in this house together, there was a period of time when they were all living there together. It was a pattern that was comfortable, there was a lot of life going on, and the house was full of people going about their everyday lives. From the flip side of the coin, it is important to note that her spouse had been diagnosed with a serious illness around 7 years before to this event. Because his illness required a big amount of care and attention, June and he were forced to make the painful decision of entrusting their dog to their granddaughter during this period of time. This decision was made because of the fact that his condition required a significant amount of care and attention. To put it another way, they were not able to successfully manage the responsibility of taking care of a pet while simultaneously monitoring his health. In spite of the fact that it was a particularly sad day, they arrived at the conclusion that it was the most prudent choice. June's husband passed away almost soon after that, and the house was suddenly filled with an awful sense of emptiness. June's spouse had been dying for quite some time. Only she was the only one who was by herself. On the other hand, the fact that she was within the confines of the house by herself did not necessarily imply that she was completely cut off from the rest of the world. The woman who had taken in her dog was not only her granddaughter, but also her grandchild, and she lived in close proximity to her the entire time. June was a constant presence in her life, and anytime she entered her environment, she welcomed her with open arms. June was a constant presence in her life. She would nearly always bring June's aged dog along with her on her regular visits. This was something that she did virtually every time. This is the manner in which she would conduct herself the vast majority of the time. Throughout those exchanges, June maintained an attitude that was one of complete and full joy. As she gazed at her dog and felt the familiar fur of her dog under her fingertips, she experienced a sense of comfort that was impossible to put into words. She felt a sense of comfort at the same time. The fact that she was thinking about her puppy allowed her to be successful in achieving this goal. Not only did June's granddaughter provide her happiness, but she also went out of her way to save her in a number of different ways. June cherished her grandchild above all else in the world. In no way, shape, or form did she ever find herself in a situation in which she was unable to offer June support with the practical duties that had become rather challenging for her. She would be responsible for performing the weekly grocery shopping, picking up her prescriptions, and picking up her meds from the pharmacy, in addition to transporting her to and from each of her doctor's appointments. In addition, she would be responsible for taking her to and from hospital appointments. Her granddaughter had made it abundantly clear on multiple occasions that all June needed to do was call, and she would be there instantly without any questions being asked. This was the only thing that June needed to do. June simply needed to provide this one command in order to complete the task. June, who had a personality that was fiercely independent, made every attempt to avoid imposing an excessive amount of dependence on her granddaughter. This was despite the fact that June had a personality that was fiercely independent. By any stretch of the imagination, she had no intention of being a burden to anyone. The most essential thing for her was to demonstrate to herself that she was still capable of standing on her own and handling things. She was mostly driven by this motivation. Something that she could look back on with a great deal of pride was the moment in question. Therefore, on this particular morning, she was simply concentrating on her routine daily ritual as she made her way down the hallway, her hand following the pattern of the wallpaper for the purpose of keeping stability. She was doing this because she was trying to keep her balance. For the very first time in her life, she turned around and went into the restroom, which was a room that she had been to a great number of times all during her existence. Without a shadow of a doubt, she never wavered from her decision. When compared to the previous instance, however, this time around, different circumstances prevailed. The moment her foot made contact with the cool tile floor, it slipped out from beneath her and she fell to the ground. The occurrence took place precisely at that precise instant. There was no opportunity to take advantage of anything that was accessible at this time, and it was not possible to provide a response at this moment in time. As she was falling, the sharp corner of the toilet counter made a forceful contact with the side of her leg, which caused her to sustain major injuries. A major injury was sustained by her as a result of this act. As a consequence of this, she began to fall more and further into the depression. The guy experienced pain that was both instantaneous and terrible right away. Even though she let out a scream, the sound was muffled by the walls of her house, which were completely barren of any residents. Despite this, she was able to hear the sound. It was nearly impossible for anyone to pick up on her voice. Only when she looked down did she notice that a lengthy cut on her leg was beginning to flow the first few droplets of blood. She was surprised to find out that the cut was bleeding. Following a little amount of time, the first sensations of shock and pain were rapidly replaced by a cold surge of anxiety brought on by the unknown. Indeed, this was the conclusion. It was the same situation that she had always been concerned about, the one that her family had cautioned her about when she was younger, and it was the same situation that she was now confronted with. When she was by herself and there was no one to assist her, she took a significant amount of harm and suffered a great deal of pain. However, she was also hurt. Despite the fact that she had always insisted on living by herself, she had never really given much thought to what she would do in the case of a significant emergency. She had never really given much thought to what she would do either. What she would do was something that she had never really given much thought to before. As far as she was concerned, her primary purpose was to protect herself from getting wounded as much as possible. She was attempting to avoid getting wounded in any way. On the other hand, this method had not shown any signs of producing any noticeable results. The fortunate circumstance for June was that she did not completely lack a safety net. This was a fortunate circumstance for her. In the aftermath of the passing of her husband, her granddaughter insisted on having a network of emergency call bells put in every room of the house. One of her goals was to have this particular action carried out. The majority of the time, these were straightforward electrical gadgets that comprised of a cord that was suspended from the ceiling. It would immediately send a notification to the phone that belonged to her granddaughter whenever the line was withdrawn as soon as it was pulled. In addition to that, it would get in touch with the emergency services in the area. The bells were discovered in the restroom of the building, which was one of the locations included in the investigation. June was attempting to ignore the throbbing pain in her leg while she was lying on the floor. She reached up and clutched for the ceiling as she attempted to concentrate on the agony. With a sense of relief, she pulled on the thread with all of her effort when she had discovered it by her hand. She was relieved to have found the thread. There was a 10-minute stretch of time that separated the two periods. After what seemed like an eternity, time seemed to continue to pass. While June remained on the floor of the restroom, she was using a hand towel to apply pressure to the incision on her leg. She was doing this in an effort to slow down the rate at which she was bleeding. That same instant, she was finally able to hear the sound that she had been eagerly anticipating. The front door of her house opened. She had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Only a few moments later, she became aware of her granddaughter's voice, which was filled with concern as she called her name. She was concerned about her grandchild. Concerned about her grandchild, she did not feel well. June made an effort to call her back and let her know where she was located, but her voice was a little muffled. At the same time, she let her know where she was. In the span of a fraction of a second, her granddaughter materialized in the vicinity of the entranceway to the restroom. In addition to this, June's senior dog was following her around and walking directly behind her, pushing past her legs as she went about her regular chores. During the time that June was lying on the ground, both of them were able to see the blood that was on her face as well as the expression of misery that was on her face. It would have been impossible to ignore the worry that her granddaughter was expressing with her words. At the time that she was given the warning, she could not have possibly thought that the cut would be as severe as it actually was. On the other hand, June experienced a profound sense of comfort when she saw her granddaughter standing there, and when she saw her dog coming over to her with its tail wagging nervously. Both of these sensations brought her a sense of relief. Her attention was drawn back to the here and now by both of these occurrences. No matter how severe the cut was, it was of no consequence, whatever the severity of the cut was. It was possible to obtain assistance. At first, it appeared as though everything was going to be well on its own. Almost immediately, her dog came up to her and began gently exploring her palm while murmuring in a low voice. It was as if it had detected that something was very wrong with her. At first glance, it appeared as though it had found out that something was definitely not right. June started to feel a little bit more at ease while her granddaughter was frantically searching through the cupboards in the bathroom for bandages and disinfectant. This occurred when June's granddaughter was seeking for these items. During the time that she was stretching out with a hand that was shaking, she began to pat her dog, who was obviously quite concerned about her. The connection that they had remained just as strong as it had been in the past, despite the fact that a considerable period of time had elapsed since they had first met. The dog's presence on the premises brought a significant degree of comfort to the individuals who were there. After a certain amount of time had passed, her granddaughter was able to successfully locate a first aid kit and eventually found her way back to the house. Bandages were placed over the wound in a secure manner with the purpose of protecting it after the wound had been thoroughly cleaned to the best of her ability during the process. By the time the paramedics arrived a few minutes later, June's mental state had greatly improved, and the most of the bleeding had stopped by that point. June's condition had also significantly improved on its own. June's condition was also showing significant signs of improvement at the same time for her. There was no doubt that the soreness in her leg continued to exist, but the presence of her granddaughter and her dog had brought about a significant change in the conditions. When the paramedics entered the crowded restroom, they brought their equipment with them, which resulted in the space becoming more crowded than it had been before. When they were squatting down to evaluate her injury, they did so in a manner that was both professional and empathetic. This was the case throughout the entire process. They began by carefully removing the improvised bandage that her granddaughter had applied to the region before proceeding to remove it for good. They did this in order to get a better look at the wound that was causing them discomfort. A reassuring smile formed on the face of one of them as they looked up at June while they were in the process of finishing the thorough cleaning. As a result of the facts that he revealed with her, she was given the impression that it was significantly more dreadful than it actually was. It was a reduction that, when everything was taken into consideration, was not quite that big. The assertion that he made was that she would not even require stitches under any circumstances. They suggested that she keep it clean and possibly have her granddaughter stay for a limited period of time in order to reduce the likelihood of her falling again. The purpose of this was to prevent her from falling again in the future. On the other hand, the medical professionals stated that she was in perfect, healthy condition. They did not display any signs that there was a cause for concern. When the paramedics were in the process of gathering their belongings and leaving the premises that they were in, June expressed her gratitude to them after they had completed their duties. It was a little time in which she, her granddaughter, and the dog were all sitting together on the floor of the restroom, and during that brief moment, there was an emotion of collective thankfulness that permeated the ambiance. They were under the impression that they had been able to avoid being struck by a gunshot. There is a possibility that the fall had a lot more devastating consequences than what was initially thought. Not just a shattered hip, but also a brain injury that was acquired throughout the incident. When I was just left with a small cut on my leg, it felt like a fortunate escape from the situation that I was previously in. When June awoke the following morning in her bed, she was immediately aware that something was wrong. August, on the other hand, was not conscious of anything at all. Her boyfriend had been the one she had been sleeping with. Despite the fact that she was merely lying there, she felt sick to her stomach since her heart was beating so hard against her ribs the entire time. In spite of the fact that she had not even sat up yet, she was experiencing nausea and vomiting. She was experiencing emotions of lightheadedness and dizziness, and she also got the impression that the room was softly spinning. She was also experiencing a feeling of lightheadedness. She was completely covered in a layer of sweat that was everywhere on her body. This was in no way typical in any way, shape, or form. A horrific experience for everyone involved was the fact that this had never happened before in the history of the world. Her granddaughter had remained at the spot for a few hours after the paramedics had left the previous day, after they had left the scene. During the time that they were having their conversation, they performed a number of things, including drinking tea, making sure that June was comfortable, and making sure that everything she required was within easy reach. Despite June's assurance that she was in good condition, her granddaughter eventually left, promising to call with an update in the morning. June told her granddaughter that she was all right. The granddaughter of June had assured her that she would call with one. June had experienced some discomfort in the area surrounding the cut on her leg that evening, which was to be expected. However, it did not appear to be a significant illness. June's leg had been cut. A cut had been made in June's leg. As she began to drift off to sleep, she was left with the impression that she had been extremely fortunate throughout the course of the day. However, at this point, which was probably 12 hours later, something was going on inside her body that was extremely, extremely wrong. This was the case. June was unable to determine with absolute certainty whether or not the cut that was on her thigh was connected to the new and concerning symptoms that she was experiencing. June was having these symptoms. As far as I can tell, this is the situation. As far as the paramedics are concerned, the event was not a particularly serious one. On the other hand, the severity of what she was going through, in conjunction with the sensation that her body was moving in the wrong direction, caused her to make the decision that she would absolutely not take any chances. Within the context of this particular situation, she did not pull the emergency cord that was available to her. She extended her hand to the phone that was put on the table next to her bed and dialed the number for an ambulance in order to have her transported to the hospital. She intended for the ambulance to take her to the hospital. The medical staff immediately became aware of her situation the moment she arrived at the emergency room, and they immediately began carrying out a battery of examinations as soon as they were aware of her condition. Her temperature was taken and blood was drawn from her as part of the comprehensive assessment of her vital signs that was carried out. After they had finally figured out what was going on, they were able to discover what was going on in a reasonably short amount of time. Upon completion of the examinations, it was found that she was suffering from a severe bacterial disease. The conclusion that was arrived at was found to be this. Upon further investigation, the medical professionals arrived at the conclusion that the open cut on her leg served as the point of entry for the bacteria that had invaded her body. Upon conducting their examination of her, they came to this ultimate conclusion. The fact that the sickness had already made its way into her system was an aspect of the circumstance that was much more distressing. It was because of this that she was experiencing feelings of lightheadedness and perspiration, and it also provided an explanation to the question of why her heart was racing so quickly. The emergency medical condition is known as sepsis, and it is a condition that poses a considerable risk to the individual who is being treated. The medical team was taken aback as a result of this, given the circumstances. They had a number of inquiries that would be considered to be of great significance. It is inconceivable that a cut that appeared to be very minor could have resulted in the development of such a severe sickness in such a short amount of time. The report that was submitted by the paramedics indicated that they had cleaned the wound in a proper manner prior to departing from the scene. There was not a single item that made any type of sense. On the other hand, at this particular moment in time, they were not directly concerned with locating an answer to the question of how it had occurred. All of their concentration was focused on making an effort to preserve June's life. Nobody else was paying attention to anything else. An emergency course of therapy was devised for her, which included the administration of potent antibiotics that were effective against a wide range of infections. When it comes to treating with an infection that is known to be unknown, this is the normal process that is followed. As a result of the fact that these antibiotics are of a more generic character, it is predicted that they will be successful in treating the bacteria that are responsible for the issue. June, on the other hand, was not receiving any kind of aid from it in any sense of the word. Her health did not improve, despite the fact that she exerted a great deal of effort. It was beyond reasonable doubt that the situation was deteriorating, and it was deteriorating at a rapid pace. At that point in time, June had already reached the age of 83, and her health was already in a position that was deemed to be relatively poor. Her physical being simply did not possess the reserves that were necessary to protect itself against such a tremendous onslaught. It was simply not feasible for her to have those reserves. The quick deterioration of her condition that was taking place was something that they witnessed right in front of their very eyes. All of the medical personnel were well aware that they were competing against the clock in order to complete their tasks. An ineffectiveness was identified with the antibiotics that were considered to be fundamental. In order for them to have any chance of surviving, it was vital for them to determine the specific type of bacteria that was responsible for this sickness. Only then could they have any hope of saving themselves. If they were able to identify the treatment, they might be able to use a treatment that is better targeted to the specific condition. As an illustration, they could be able to make use of an antibiotic that has been developed with the express purpose of eliminating that particular intruder. In order to isolate and identify the microscopic foe that was responsible for her death, they started doing further tests, one of which was the culture of her blood. This was done in an effort to solve the mystery of what caused her death. It was of the utmost importance that they obtain responses, and they anticipated receiving them as quickly as possible. When June's granddaughter arrived at the hospital, she was greeted by a doctor who then proceeded to have a conversation with her. June's granddaughter had rushed to the hospital as soon as she heard the news. Her granddaughter, June, had hurriedly made her way to the hospital. In addition to requesting that she walk him through the events that had taken place the day before, beginning with the moment she arrived at the house, he also demanded that she guide him through each step of the process. Every single thing was crucial to him, regardless of how minor or unimportant it might appear to be. He was meticulous in his attention to detail. His attention to detail was impeccable in every single respect. He inquired about the fall, the wound, and the method in which she wrapped it. He asked these questions in order to have more information. In spite of the fact that her voice was quivering with nervousness during the entirety of the story, the granddaughter continued to relate the tale. The manner in which she discovered her grandma laying on the ground, the manner in which she sought for the first aid kit, and the manner in which the paramedics arrived at the scene were all meticulously described in her narrative. While the physician was attentively listening, he nodded his head in agreement with what was being said. An inquiry was made by him. He made an inquiry. He inquired, "Was there anything else?" he asked. The granddaughter pondered for a little period of time. "Has there been anything at all that occurred in the restroom while you were searching for bandages?" From that very moment on, her thoughts were a jumbled mixture of panic and confusion. She was worried about anything that had occurred in the restroom, and she was anxious about it. Following that, however, a picture was presented to the viewer. She murmured in a quiet voice, "Her dog," saying it. "That's her dog. I brought her dog with me. He was in there with us." The doctor's approach remained the same. However, he leaned in somewhat closer to the patient who was present. "That's her dog." He made the request, "Tell me about the dog," and I said that I would comply with his request. "I brought her dog with me. What was the dog doing?" As the granddaughter reflected on the series of occurrences that had taken place, she began to experience tears welling up in her eyes. She made it clear that he was merely attempting to alleviate the suffering that she was going through at the time. A look of rising terror appeared on her face as she hesitated and said June was on the floor petting him. He was licking her hand and, oh God, he was licking her leg. He was licking the cut. I didn't think anything of it. I thought he was just trying to clean it, to make her feel better. The doctor thanked her and instructed her to wait to return to the laboratory. After that, he hurriedly went back to the laboratory in order to proceed with his journey before continuing on. In spite of the fact that his suspicion was a disastrous one, he was able to develop it. There was a point in time when the findings from the laboratory were brought back to the laboratory. After everything was said and done, the tests were successful in identifying the bacteria that should be eliminated. However, by the time they were able to determine the name, it was already too late for any treatment that was specifically targeted to make a difference in the circumstance where they found themselves. Her immune system was completely weakened by the virus, and it took complete control of her body. As June was suffering from acute sepsis, a condition that offers a significant threat to her chances of survival, she was in a terrible danger of not surviving. When the body's response to an infection becomes so intense that it begins to cause harm to the body's own tissues and important organs, the signs of this condition become apparent. This disorder is characterized by a dysfunction in the immune system. Because her body was making a frantic effort to defend itself against the invasion, her body was, in effect, shutting himself down. This was because her body was trying to combat the invasion. The members of the medical staff were successful in doing everything that they were able to successfully complete. Despite their efforts to treat her with a variety of treatments and even put her on life support, the illness continued to progress without any interruptions. However, these precautions were not adequate to prevent the virus from spreading further. As a result of the illness that she had been afflicted with, June Baxter passed dead just 1 week after she was sent to the hospital for treatment. In the end, it would be revealed that the potentially harmful bacteria that had made its way into June's open wound had been administered to her in the most heinous and unexpected manner that could possibly be dreamt of. The situation would be like this. Additionally, the bacterium was referred to as Pastorella multocida for the purpose of providing additional information. However, the bacterium in question is not the kind that is generally discovered on the floor of a lavatory or in the nook of a countertop. This is because the bacterium in question is not a mold. It is specifically located in the interior of the lips of domestic cats and dogs. Examples of these animals include cats and dogs. The location in question is really specific. During the time that June was waiting for her granddaughter to locate bandages, her cherished and elderly dog was behaving in the same manner that it had always done. This took place at the same time that June was making herself comfortable on the floor of the restroom. The purpose of this was to comfort her that there was nothing wrong with her. It was able to convey its feelings of compassion and concern for the people who were in its close area by utilizing the only means that were accessible to it. In addition, the dog had begun licking the wound that was exposed in front of her as a means of providing her with some degree of comfort for the time being. Irrespective of the fact that it was a gesture of affection toward a member of its pack who had been harmed, it was also an inclination to care for the individual in question. However, as a result of this action, the dog had unwittingly delivered the germs that caused Pastorella multocida into June's bloodstream. This illness was caused by the bacteria that caused the disease. The dog's saliva included these microorganisms which were discovered. The wound had been cleaned by the paramedics when they arrived. Nevertheless, by the time they had finished, the germs had already started to spread throughout the body. It became impossible to maintain control over the situation, and it started to grow at a breakneck speed. In spite of the fact that the individual had been younger and in better health, it is still feasible that the immune system would have been able to prevent the illness from happening. On the other hand, there was a sentence of death for a woman who was 83 years old and experienced significant health issues prior to the sentence being handed down. Her execution was carried out. The aftermath of the catastrophe was unfortunately a very unpleasant one due to the circumstances. To put it another way, there was no offense that required legal action to be taken, and there was no one who was to blame for the situation. An extremely peculiar accident occurred as a result of a fleeting time of feelings of devotion. The accident was caused by a brief moment of devotion. In light of the events that transpired, June's granddaughter was left with a significant amount of humiliation that she had to carry with her. She had to come to grips with the fact that she had unknowingly set in motion the series of events that ultimately led to her grandmother's dying by bringing the dog that she thought would provide her grandmother with peace. She had brought the puppy to her grandmother in the mistaken belief that it would provide her with comfort. She was forced to confront the reality that she was the one who was responsible for the passing of her grandma. The dog that June had loved so much, the one that served as a live link to her late husband and happier times, was the unknowing instrument that had led to her passing away earlier than she had intended. June had loved the puppy so much that it served as a living link to her husband and happier times. The dog had been of great affection to June. The painful irony that exists is one that, when everything is taken into consideration, is nearly impossible to fathom. It was a simple fall, a small cut, and an act of love from a devoted pet that all came together in the most terrible way possible, resulting in the death of a woman who had only wanted to spend her final years in the quiet and freedom of her own home. The woman's death was the result of all of these little things coming together. Friends and family of the deceased woman suffered a terrible loss when she passed away. To begin, I would like to convey my appreciation for your presence in this room today. In the event that you watch the program that was broadcast tonight, I would be grateful if you could please share your thoughts with me in the comment section. It is also important to keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime available for you to view all at once right now. Within a single sitting, you are able to watch all of these episodes, at least until the next time we get together. How are things going? The arrival of a police officer by the name of Guohu Wen occurred a few minutes after the initial call was placed. Several emergency medical technicians and a small team of additional officers joined him at that moment. The area was devoid of noise and darkness, with the only source of illumination being the flashing red and blue lights of their cars. The emergency medical technicians were the first to approach the gray automobile, and they soon confirmed what everyone else who was there at the incident already knew. She had passed away while she was inside the vehicle. It was instantly apparent to the authorities that the wound was caused by a bullet because it was a small circular wound that was located directly below her left ear. In order to protect any potential evidence, Officer Guo gave his troops the instruction to seal the area and draw up a perimeter with yellow tape. His crew and he started their inquiry as soon as the cordon was put in place. The very first thing that Guo did was examine the body of the woman in further detail, attempting to piece together the events that transpired up until her death. It appeared as though she had just pulled over as she was still sitting erect in the driver's seat. After looking around, he noticed a single bullet casing lying on the ground just outside the open door on the driver's side. From the inside of the vehicle, he was able to make out what appeared to be small pieces of shining metal, similar to copper particles that had been shot out of a round. Nevertheless, there was not a single gun in sight anywhere. Officer Guo and his colleagues were aware that they were faced with a murder at this point in time. However, as he stood there, taking everything in, looking at the car, the body, and the length of highway that was completely deserted, he began to grasp the idea that the entire site appeared to be strange. To begin, he examined the terrain that was located behind the tires of the vehicle. There were no skid marks to be found. Consequently, this indicated that the woman must have made a controlled and deliberate decision to pull over. She hadn't been pushed off the road by another vehicle, to the best of our knowledge. In the second place, the glass on the driver's side of her vehicle was completely lowered. This didn't make any sense. It is possible that she had been driving with it down from the beginning, or that she had rolled it down after she had stopped without any problems. A third point to consider is that there was not the slightest indication of a battle. Before she was shot, there was no indication that this woman had been in any way comatose or terrified of anything. There was no evidence that her phone had fallen to the ground, rather it was still positioned on the passenger seat. Despite the fact that she had not even unbuckled her seatbelt. In general, it appeared as though this woman had been unexpectedly peaceful in her closing moments, as if she had no notion that she was about to be put to death. Officer Guo was led to believe that the person who shot her was most likely someone she knew as a result of this. In the middle of the night, on a highway that was completely empty, she rolled down her window for someone she trusted enough to do for her. So Guo was aware that the first thing he needed to do was to identify this woman, and then he needed to determine who was their closest friend. It was going to be run through the system to determine who the owner of the car was when he took down the license plate number of the vehicle. Just at that moment, however, another cop approached him while displaying a perplexed expression. Guo was informed by the officer that they had discovered anything peculiar inside the vehicle. In the storage pocket on the driver's side door, they discovered 4 small shreds of paper. As to whether or not this was connected to the crime, they were unsure. On each scrap, there were what appeared to be small pieces of words or figures that were scrawled. The shards had the letters 65, Dalo, Z, and Da written on them. It appeared that none of these pieces on their own had any significance. They appeared to have been torn from a bigger sheet of paper where they had been contained. The words were little more than fragments of words. They were not whole thoughts. The police attempted to arrange the 4 parts in a variety of various ways in order to determine whether or not they might make a coherent message. However, their efforts were fruitless. Every single thing was utterly absurd. Based on his observations, Officer Guo concluded that the fragments were most likely nothing more than junk that had been sitting in the vehicle for some time. However, as a precautionary measure, he instructed his officers to gather them up and submit them as evidence. It was impossible to predict what may become significant in the future. Officer Guo and a member of his team entered a huge housing complex in New Taipei City a few hours later. The complex was located to the north of the city. The location where they had discovered the woman in the gray sedan earlier that morning was approximately 40 miles away from where they were now. On their way to a particular apartment, they rode an elevator to the top floor and knocked on the door. The door was opened by a man of middle age after a brief duration. When he saw two law enforcement officers standing at his door, he appeared highly surprised and a little anxious. It was Officer Guo who inquired of the individual whether his name was Shu B. Chung, to which the man responded with a nod and a yes, it was. In this point in time, Guo and his team had successfully identified the victim of the murder. She was 43 years old and went by the name of Hua Si. She lived in this very apartment with her 3 children and the man who had just opened the door, Shu B. Chung, according to the information that they discovered when they began investigating her personal life. This was the first peculiar aspect of her life. Shu had been her ex-husband from the beginning. The couple had made the decision to continue living together in order to co-parent their children, despite the fact that they had divorced 5 years back. Due to the fact that he was Hua's ex-husband, Shu was an obvious person of interest in the murder of Hua. Nevertheless, Officer Guo was uncertain about what Shu knew at this point or whether he knew anything at all on the subject. Therefore, it was necessary for him to exercise caution in the manner in which he approached the conversation. To begin, Officer Guo introduced himself and his partner to the audience. After that, he inquired of Shu whether or not he had met with his ex-wife in recent times. According to Shu, he had not communicated with her since the previous evening, and he indicated his disagreement by shaking his head. On the other hand, he stated that their most recent conversation had been exceptionally peculiar. I was informed by Shu that Hua had left their apartment the night before at approximately 8:45 p.m. On the opposite side of the city, she was supposed to be attending a meeting with the proprietor of a pawn shop. In his statement, he stated that she owed a significant amount of money to the proprietor of the pawn shop and that they were supposed to be discussing a repayment plan. Nevertheless, Shu informed him that Hua had called him at approximately 9:30 p.m. while she was on her way to join this meeting. When she told him that she was on Highway 61, she also mentioned that another vehicle was following her. It was Shu who informed the officers that he had attempted to calm her down. It was probably just somebody driving the same route as her, he told her, and then he assured her that there was no reason to be concerned about it. First, he stated that Hua appeared to be in agreement, and then he hung up the phone. In order to check on Hua, he reportedly attempted to call her again a short while later, but she did not pick up the phone. He continued to try, according to Shu. He claimed that he called her 10 more times after that, but she never answered her phone again. In point of fact, he claimed that she never acknowledged his calls. As a result, Shu disclosed to the officers that he was unaware of the circumstances surrounding his ex-wife. Whether or not she ever showed up for the meeting was a mystery to him. He was unaware of her current location at the time. When Officer Guo first heard this story, his initial reaction was one of not believing what he was hearing. The entire tale seemed completely ridiculous to me. If Shu had genuine knowledge that Hua was possibly being followed on a dark highway, at night, by herself, while she was on her way to a high-stakes meeting with a person to whom she owed money, and then she suddenly stopped answering her phone, then she would have been able to prevent Ha from being followed. What on earth could have prevented him from calling the authorities? Have you, at the very least, made an effort to go and look for her? Instead, he simply put in a number of calls to her, and when she did not pick up, he simply shrugged it off and continued on with his night. In spite of the fact that the mother of his 3 children was in a potentially dangerous situation, he did nothing. A person's reaction seemed to be quite peculiar to me at the time. Since this was the case, Officer Guo kept a close eye on Shu as he broke the unfortunate news. He apologized profusely to him, but they had discovered his ex-wife early that morning. He told him he was very sorry. Inside her vehicle, which was parked on the shoulder of the road, she had been brutally murdered. This caused Shu's eyes to widen in response to what he heard. Suddenly, he started shaking, and he appeared to be completely taken aback. It appeared to Guo as though he was experiencing a genuine reaction of shock, as if he was unable to believe what he was hearing. As a result of Guo's extensive experience as a law enforcement officer, he was unable to be certain. The man's expression of grief was so convincing that he was unable to determine whether it was genuine or whether it was just an act. No matter what happened, Guo was aware of the next step he needed to take. He was required to investigate each and every aspect of Shu's story in order to determine whether or not he could discover any gaps in it. Guo and his team asked the manager of the apartment complex for any surveillance footage that was available from the previous night. This request was made after the interview had concluded. At the time that Shu claimed that Hua had left the apartment, they wanted to verify whether or not she had actually left. Additionally, the manager was able to retrieve some footage from a camera that was located inside the elevator of the building. The video did, in fact, demonstrate that Hua left at approximately 8:45 p.m., as Shu had asserted, but it also demonstrated something else that Officer Guo found to be extremely peculiar. In the video, Hua is seen entering the elevator, and it is assumed that she is on her way to meet with the proprietor of the pawn shop. However, she was not by herself. Her former husband, Shu, was riding in the elevator with her at the time. And while they were on the way down, Shu leaned in close to Hua and kissed her thoroughly for a full 8 seconds. Following that, he gave her a bear hug until the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened there. From the outside, this may appear to be nothing more than a typical tender moment shared by a couple who are deeply in love with one another. On the other hand, it was quite peculiar in this particular instance for two distinct reasons. Initially, Hua and Shu went through with a divorce. As far as Guo was aware, they were no longer a romantic couple despite their previous relationship. They were merely co-parents of the child. Furthermore, it was peculiar because in Taiwanese culture, public displays of affection are extremely rare, particularly among the older generations. This was a particularly peculiar aspect of the situation. Outside of their own home, it would be extremely unusual for a couple in their middle years to passionately embrace and kiss one another in such a public setting. The only explanation that made sense to Officer Guo for why Shu would act in such a manner while riding the elevator was if he was aware that something terrible was going to take place to his ex-wife. Instead of appearing to be a passionate kiss, it appeared to be a farewell kiss from the beginning. They discovered additional issues with Shu's account as the investigation progressed further. According to what they discovered, the proprietor of the pawn shop did in fact exist, and Hua did in fact owe him a significant amount of money. However, when the police were able to locate him and speak with him, he stated that he was completely incapable of understanding what they were discussing. He stated that he had not intended to meet with Hua on the evening of her passing, despite his previous intentions. Not a single meeting took place. A surveillance video from Highway 61, which was the road where Hua's body was discovered, was also able to be accessed by the police. It is true that the cameras did not cover the precise location where the murder took place. However, they did record footage of Hua's car driving along the highway at 9:30 p.m., which is the exact time that Shu stated she had called him to tell him that she was being followed. The video, however, makes it abundantly clear that there was no other vehicle following Hua. It was just her driving by herself. Officer Guo believed that it was much more likely that Shu was the one who was lying now, making up the story about the car following his ex-wife in order to create a false lead for the police. Although it was technically possible that Ha had lied to her ex-husband for some unknown reason, Officer Guo believed that it was much more likely that Shu was what was lying. As soon as Officer Guo and his team were aware of all of this information, they returned to the apartment complex and re-examined all of the surveillance footage stored there. To determine whether or not they were able to follow Shu's movements on the night of the murder, they also obtained a warrant for the records of his mobile phone, which included his GPS data. However, the reality that they discovered only made matters more complicated. It appears that Shu had been inside his apartment throughout the entire night, as evidenced by the surveillance footage from the building as well as the pings from his cell phone. After he had finished saying his goodbyes to Hua in the elevator, he went back upstairs and remained there until he left. The possibility that he was the one who personally drove out to Highway 61 and shot Hua was completely out of the question. According to Officer Guo, however, this did not imply that Shu was innocent. Only the theory was altered as a result. One of the things that he pondered was whether or not Shu had hired someone to carry out the murder on his behalf. Even though he did not have any evidence, he had a strong feeling that Shu had to be involved in some way, no matter what. However, that theory did not provide sufficient answers to a great deal of questions. To put it another way, why would Shu have wanted Hua to disappear in the first place? Why would Hua have been so calm to pull over and open her car window for a total stranger if it turned out that the person she was about to kill was a hired killer? That didn't make any sense. After giving it some thought for a short period of time, Officer Guo eventually came up with an idea. It's possible that the person Shu hired wasn't a complete stranger. Perhaps the assassin was someone that Hua was familiar with and trusted. A number of months had passed. Officer Guo and one of his friends were now occupying a comfortable office located in a high-rise building in New Taipei City while they were chatting. They were seated atop a massive desk that had been meticulously polished. One of the individuals that worked in this workplace was seated behind the desk. One of Hua's brothers, he was. Officer Guo and his colleagues continued to operate under the assumption that the individual who had carried out the murder of Hua was most likely acquainted with her. Over the course of the past few months, they had spent their time painstakingly searching for and conducting interviews with each and every individual on her roster of cell phone contacts. In spite of the fact that they had not discovered any fresh suspects as of yet, they had discovered some highly interesting information regarding Hua's life. According to the evidence, Hua had not just been in debt to the proprietor of that one-pawn business. In addition, she owed money to a number of different banks, several friends, and even members of her own family. In addition to this, they found out that she owed money to a number of very dodgy black market lenders. All things considered, she had racked up a debt that was about comparable to $500,000 in United States currency. Furthermore, in light of this information, the connection between Hua and her ex-husband Shu became somewhat more comprehensible. The reason that Hua and Shu had split was not because they had lost affection for one another, according to a number of people who had shared their thoughts with Guo. Because of all of this debt, Hua's credit was so awful that Shu wanted to legally separate his finances from hers in order to protect himself. This was done for the purpose of protecting himself. According to all accounts, the couple, despite the fact that they had officially divorced, continued to be deeply in love with one another and were entirely devoted to both their children and to each other. Officer Guo and his squad were left feeling a little disoriented as a result of this new information. Despite the fact that Shu had first given off a very suspicious vibe, Guo did not have any concrete evidence that connected him to the crime. At this point, it appeared as though he did not even have a clear motive. At this point, Guo was sitting in this luxurious office directly across from Hua's brother, and all he could do was hope that some new piece of information, or any piece of information at all, would show up. Guo and his partner approached the brother and requested that he supply them with all of the information that he possessed regarding Hua, including her marriage, her debts, and anything else that he believed would be pertinent to her passing. The brother gave a slight nod and then began to speak. The things that he was saying, however, seemed to sound a lot like the other stories that Guo had already heard. This became apparent quite soon. He discussed the difficulties she was having financially, as well as her relationship with Shu. The knowledge was not brand new. They had heard this narrative again and again, and it was the same one. Therefore, as the brother continued to speak, Guo's attention began to wander away from what he was saying. His eyes started to travel around the apartment, taking in the view of the city as well as the beautiful furnishings that was there. After some time had passed, Guo's attention was drawn to a bookcase that was situated behind the brother's desk. Also, he observed that there was a single piece of paper that was protruding from the space between two books that were stored on the shelf. Even though Guo could only see a small portion of it at this moment, he was able to determine that the paper contained handwriting based on what he could see. In addition, the penmanship appeared to be familiar. Consequently, Guo silently stood up from his chair without making any noise, while the brother was still in the middle of telling a sentence. As he made his way around the large desk to the bookcase, he removed the piece of paper that he had been looking for. And the moment he laid eyes on it, his heart started beating extremely fast. Instantaneously, he recognized that the handwriting on this piece of paper was identical to the handwriting that was found on the 4 small scraps of paper that they had discovered at the scene of the crime. The very same leftovers that they had in the past, considered to be garbage. It wasn't only the penmanship that was the problem, though. Upon closer inspection, Guo noticed that the real words, or bits of words, as well as the number that was written on those fragments, were literally written on this piece of paper. When he looked at the document that Hua had torn up, he understood that he was looking at a complete copy of the document that had been in her car. When he first started, he had only 4 insignificant small pieces. The document was now being examined in its entirety by him. And as Guo went back and read it again, it was as if everyone and everything suddenly fell into place. The fragments that they discovered, including the letters 65, Dalo, Z, and Da, were not just random pieces of gibberish. These were snippets of street names and addresses that were scattered about. It turned out that the complete message that Guo was currently looking at was actually a comprehensive list of geographical directions. Furthermore, whomever was following them would be able to pinpoint the precise place on Highway 61 where Hua was killed by following these recommendations. Therefore, following this remarkable discovery, the authorities were able to figure out the complete tale of what transpired with Hua in a very short amount of time. They were finally able to identify the person who was responsible for her murder. However, unbelievably, the person responsible for the crime was not Hua's brother, despite the fact that this damning piece of evidence was discovered in his office. Instead, it would emerge out that the narrative of Hua's murder was far more terrible and much darker than anyone could have possibly imagined it to be. The event started 1 month before to Hua's passing away. It was at that time that 3 individuals, all of whom desired Hua's death, got together to devise a strategy. Hua's brother, Hua's ex-husband Shu, and the person who was the brains behind the entire operation were the 3 individuals in question. Within the context of this gathering, the 3 of them came to the conclusion that none of them desired to get their own hands dirty. Consequently, they would employ a hitman to carry out the act for them. They made the decision that once they had identified the appropriate individual, they would have Hua murdered at a location that was neutral. It was a particular location on the side of Highway 61 that they selected. They chose a date and time for her execution that would be convenient, a time when that portion of the road would be essentially deserted, and in an area where there were no security cameras and very few streetlights. In addition, they chose a location that would permit them to carry out the execution. The reason that her ex-husband Shu rode down the apartment elevator with her and held and kissed her in that peculiar, extended display of devotion was because he knew exactly what was going to happen to Hua on the night that she was due to be killed. This was the reason why he did all of these things. He was saying his last farewell to the world. Shu got in touch with Hua's brother after Hua had left the apartment complex and moved away in his vehicle. Following that, the brother called the assassin whom they had hired. After that, the assassin followed the directions that the brother had written down for him, which were the identical directions that Officer Guo had discovered in his office, in order to arrive at the prearranged site where they were going to assassinate Hua. Upon arriving at the location, the assassin simply parked his vehicle on the side of the road, turned off his lights, and waited for the assassin to arrive. A short while later, the assassin seen Hua's gray sedan go by him and then come to a controlled halt on the shoulder of the road, directly in front of where he was standing. Therefore, at this point, the assassin exited his vehicle and walked away. It was then that he approached Hua's vehicle. Her window had already been down. He drew a gun and fired a single shot at her, one that was aimed right below the ear. However, it would emerge out that Hua herself was the third person who met up with the ex-husband, and the brother, the person who wanted Hua to be killed, and the person who was the ultimate mastermind behind Hua's death. The fact why Hua had those directions in her car, which she eventually tore up and attempted to get rid of, was due to the fact that she required those directions in order to arrive at the location where she was going to be murdered. This is the reason why she remained so calm. This is the reason why she came to a stop so easily. Because of this, the assassin was able to approach her vehicle without any type of resistance and shoot her without any kind of resistance. In anticipation of his arrival, she had lowered the window and was waiting for him. After further investigation, the police discovered that Hua had purchased a substantial life insurance policy for herself. The amount of money it was worth was so high that it would have been enough to pay off all of her crushing debt while still leaving her family with a significant amount of money to continue living on. She had planned her own murder as a form of self-sacrifice that was both desperate and tragic, with the intention of providing a better life for her children and the guy whom she still loved. At the end of the day, she was successful in persuading her brother and her ex-husband to assist her with this scheme in exchange for a portion of the money from the insurance policy. It turned out that her scheme was unsuccessful in the end. The findings of the investigation lead the insurance company to conclude that Hua's death was a suicide rather than a homicide. As a consequence of this, they did not provide her family with even a single $1 in compensation. There were a number of significant allegations that were brought against Shu, Hua's brother, and the hitman that they hired. These charges included assisting suicide and paying insurance fraud. They each received terms that ranged from 6.5 to 7 years in prison for their respective offenses. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? On paper, Austin Harrouff had the kind of childhood most people would envy. He was born on the 21st of December, 1996, to a dentist, father, and a pharmacist mother, and grew up in Palm Beach County, Florida, one of the wealthiest areas in the entire country. It was the kind of place filled with luxury homes, sunshine, and opportunity. By 2021, more than 40 billionaires lived in the county, and for most of Austin's early life, everything seemed stable, comfortable, and normal. But in 2010, when Austin was 13 years old, that stability suddenly cracked. His parents announced they were getting a divorce. For Austin and his younger sister, Haley, who was only a year younger than him, the news was a massive shock. And what made it even more overwhelming was how quickly everything changed afterward. Within that same year, both of their parents had already started new relationships. Suddenly, the life Austin had always known felt completely different almost overnight. Now, of course, this was a huge shock to Austin and to his younger sister Haley, who was only a year younger than him. But, by all accounts, they both adjusted to their new normal relatively quickly. A big part of that was because the kids didn't have to move out. They got to stay in the familiar family home with their mom, which provided a sense of stability. Their father did move out, but he made sure to get a home that was very close by, so he was never far away. The family dynamic had changed, but the core pieces were still there. About a year after the divorce, Austin began high school, and he didn't just attend, he absolutely excelled. From day one, he was placed into all advanced classes, and even within these challenging courses filled with the brightest students, Austin was consistently at the top of his class. He was smart, dedicated, and driven. Austin was also a big athletic guy. He stood at about 6 feet tall and weighed a solid 200 pounds. So, naturally, he gravitated towards sports. He played football for all 4 years. He was in high school, a significant commitment. And for 1 year, his sophomore year, he also took up wrestling. But despite his size and his willingness to play these very rough, very physical sports, Austin was not an aggressive person by nature. In fact, his football coaches actually used to criticize him for not being aggressive enough. On game days, they would try to get him worked up, try to make him mad, hoping that it would inspire him to go out on the field and just smash some people. But it never really worked. Because Austin was just Austin. He was a laid-back, easygoing guy who was actually much more interested in helping people than he was in hurting them. Towards the end of his high school years, this desire to help people became a central focus for him. He became almost obsessed with trying to identify a career path that would allow him to help the most people possible. And he was so genuinely passionate about this that whenever he spoke about it, a huge involuntary smile would just appear on his face. It was impossible to miss his enthusiasm. Because of this, and because of Austin's generally happy and positive disposition, his father very lovingly started referring to him as the happy boy. Shortly before Austin's high school graduation in 2015, a letter arrived in the mail that would set the course for his future. It was from Florida State University, and it was a letter of acceptance, informing him that he had been admitted into their prestigious 4-year pre-med program. Austin had settled on medicine as being the ultimate way he could fulfill his dream of helping people. So, being accepted into this very competitive program was like a best-case scenario come to life. The news sent waves of excitement through the family. Austin and his parents, his sister, they were all absolutely elated. That summer that followed his high school graduation was totally charmed. Austin was on cloud 9, living out the final carefree days before heading off to college. He spent a lot of time with his family, soaking up the moments with his parents and his sister. He hung out with his friends, making memories they would all look back on. Then, finally, at the end of the summer, the day came. His family packed all of his belongings into the car, and they all drove 6 hours north to Tallahassee, where the Florida State campus was located. They helped him move into his new dorm room, setting up his new life. And afterwards, they gave him a big hug, wished him good luck, and they left. I'm sure on that long ride back home, his family members thought to themselves that Austin was doing so great. He wasn't just ready for college, he was ready to be an adult. He was ready to live on his own, to be responsible, to chase his dreams. And at the end of Austin's first year in college, that belief seemed to be entirely accurate. On the surface, he was thriving. Austin got excellent grades in his demanding pre-med courses. He met a nice girlfriend. And even though he wasn't playing organized sports like football anymore, he had found another athletic outlet in bodybuilding. He became passionate about fitness and even built a decent-sized social media presence around his bodybuilding journey. From the outside, he was the picture of success. But underneath all of this public success that Austin was having that year, he was actually struggling a lot of the time. He just wasn't telling anyone. He kept a journal, and in its private pages, he documented a deep and persistent sense of inadequacy. This feeling was caused primarily by his perception that his peers didn't accept him, that he didn't fit in. And so he would write endlessly about how if he could just stop being so shy, if he could just be more assertive and more outgoing, then more people would embrace him. They would like him. They would finally accept him. Over the course of that year, Austin also started to self-medicate, abusing different substances to cope with his inner turmoil. These included things like alcohol and marijuana, but also Vyvanse. Vyvanse is a powerful stimulant drug typically used to treat people with attention deficit disorder, and he was using it without a prescription. He also began experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs like acid and mushrooms, and he tried MDMA, which is a kind of cross between a stimulant and a hallucinogen, and those are just the drugs that we are aware he was taking. It's entirely possible, even likely, that he was taking other drugs too. So, Austin began to oscillate between these two extremes. He would be on the high of whatever drug or combination of drugs he was on, and then he would crash down to the low of his sober mind, which was a mind totally saturated with anxious and depressive thoughts. Before the end of that first school year, Austin was secretly poised for a full-blown mental breakdown. And it seemed like on some level he knew it was coming, too. In the last month before the end of school, his internet search history paints a terrifying picture of his state of mind. It was filled with desperate questions. Questions like, I think I'm crazy, what do I do, and how do you know if you're crazy? He searched for how to deal with obsessive thoughts. And then there were searches that suggested a complete disconnect from reality. Do I need to sleep? And what happens if you don't sleep? It was clear from these searches that he was starting to seriously question his own sanity. He was lost and scared. When Austin finally returned back home from Florida State for the summer, his family immediately noticed there was something deeply wrong with him. This was not the same happy boy who had left for college less than a year ago. Within just a few days of being home, Austin had moved his bed from his comfortable bedroom down into the family garage. When his family asked him why, he gave them a chilling explanation. He said the house was full of demons. At night, instead of sleeping, Austin would patrol the house. He would literally just walk all around the house all night long, never stopping. And every 2 hours, like clockwork, he would knock on the bedroom doors of his family members. He would knock and then loudly announce that he was guarding them from the demons in the house. Now, you can imagine how his family felt at the time. This behavior was so unbelievably weird, so totally out of character for the Austin they knew, that they just didn't really know what to do. Even though it was obvious that something was terribly wrong, they didn't immediately jump into action. At first, the only thing they did was to just start locking their bedroom doors at night to prevent Austin from coming inside during his strange nighttime patrols. But as the summer progressed, Austin's behavior didn't get any better. He continued to act totally bizarre, totally weird, with no rational explanation. His family became more and more convinced that he must be on drugs. To them, that was the only thing that could possibly explain this complete and total personality shift. So, when they confronted him about his drug use, he would admit it. He told them he was taking drugs, lots of different drugs, psychedelics, stimulants, you name it. And so naturally, his family latched onto his drug use as being the root cause of all his strange behavior. They focused their efforts almost exclusively on that one issue, on trying to get Austin clean again, believing that if they could just stop the drugs, their old son, the happy boy, would return. But towards the end of the summer, something shifted. Austin insisted that he wasn't taking any drugs anymore. But even with that claim, he was still acting totally crazy, totally unhinged. So, around mid-August, the family decided they had to do something more drastic. They decided they had to utilize something in Florida called the Baker Act. Under the Baker Act, individuals who are suspected of having a severe mental illness can be detained for up to 72 hours at the request of their loved one. And during these 72 hours, this individual is thoroughly assessed by medical professionals to see what's going on with them. Then, at the end of those 72 hours, they're given a treatment plan that their family is supposed to help them enact. It was a serious step, but they felt they had no other choice. But before the family could put this plan into motion, something horrific happened. On the morning of August 15th, one of Austin's very close friends, someone he had known since the second grade, got an unexpected visit. Austin just showed up at his house without calling ahead or letting him know, which was very uncharacteristic. The friend opened the door, and Austin just stood there and asked him a single bizarre question. "What year was I born?" The friend, confused, answered, 1996. As soon as Austin heard the answer, he didn't give any reaction to it. He just turned around, walked away, and left. So, this longtime friend is standing in his doorway, watching Austin walk away, wondering what on earth is going on with this guy. Is he high on drugs? Is he drunk? What was that all about? The friend goes back inside his house, and he's thinking to himself, what should I do? After a couple of minutes, he decides he has to call Austin just to make sure he's okay. So he calls him, and Austin picks up. It's unclear exactly what they talked about on the phone, but the friend managed to convince Austin to come back to his house and just spend the day with him. In reality, the friend just wanted to keep an eye on him to make sure Austin was okay. So Austin comes back to the friend's house. Then the two of them would actually leave the house and meet up with some of their other friends who were also in town for the summer. They also met up with Austin's sister, Haley. The group decided they were going to go to the beach for the day. But on their walk to the beach, Austin tells the group that he just needs to get something from his house and that he'll meet them down at the water. At this point, the group believes Austin is more or less fine, maybe just a little off. So they say, okay, yep, we'll meet you down there. So Austin breaks off from the group and goes to his house. When he comes back to the beach and meets up with his friends again, he has completely changed his outfit. He was now wearing this very thick, large football jersey. He was wearing long sweatpants that were also very thick. He had on 2 wristwatches, one on each wrist. And he had on sunglasses. As he walks down onto the beach, his friends look up at him. It's super hot out, and they're at the beach in Florida in August. This is a totally weird and inappropriate outfit to have on, and immediately they start kind of giving him a hard time about it, teasing him about his strange outfit choice. But Austin did not think it was funny at all. At first, he was just quiet. But then he kind of lashed out at them and said, "If you tell me I'm crazy, I will kill you." At this, his friends immediately stopped teasing him. Everyone just said, "Okay, man. Hey, didn't mean anything by it. Just giving you a hard time. No big deal." But Austin was clearly worked up, very agitated. So his sister comes over to him and she's trying to calm him down, telling him, "Hey, calm down. It's okay. It's not a big deal." And during this conversation, Austin suddenly seems to go back to being somewhat normal again. He turns to his sister and he says, completely seriously, "I'm actually half horse and I'm immortal." His sister is just stunned. She looks at him and says, "What? You really need to get professional help. You need to see a therapist or a psychologist or something. Something is wrong with you, and it's been wrong all summer. You need to get help." Now, apparently, Austin actually responded to this very positively. He looked at her and said, "I agree. There is something going on, and I do need to get help." You're right. So after that strange exchange, Austin and the rest of the group, they stayed at the beach for several more hours. Then, in the evening time, Austin, his sister, and that same very close friend, the guy who saw Austin in the morning, when he asked what year he was born, they all said they had to leave. The trio leaves the beach and they head to Duffy's, which was a local restaurant in town. They were going there to meet up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend for dinner. So, as they're getting to this restaurant, they're walking along the sidewalk, getting closer and closer, when suddenly Austin turns to his sister and says, "Hey, I need to test out my immortality." And then he just turns away from her, away from the sidewalk, and starts walking directly into traffic. He was just going to let a car hit him to test if he was truly immortal. His sister, with incredible reflexes, immediately was able to grab him. She pulled him back onto the sidewalk and then basically stood on his left side, physically preventing him from running out into the traffic again. She kind of pushed him along up the sidewalk right up to the front door of the restaurant. And when they got there, Austin had stopped trying to walk into traffic. He was acting normal again. It was there at the entrance that the trio met up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend. The 5 of them then went inside Duffy's restaurant. It was about 7:45 p.m. when they got inside. They were very quickly sat at a table in the very back of the restaurant in a booth, and there happened to be a CCTV camera that was watching them while they were inside the building. So they're all sitting at this booth, and about 3 minutes after having sat down, Austin gets up. He walks away from the booth and walks as if he's going towards the bathroom. But then he stops. He doesn't go to the bathroom. He turns around and walks back towards the front of the building, and then he walks right out the front doors. He just leaves the restaurant altogether. Now, it's unclear if the rest of his family at the table saw him do this. It doesn't seem like they did. But just a minute later, Austin comes back inside the restaurant and just walks right back to his table and sits down like absolutely nothing had ever happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Austin would get up again from his table. Except this time, instead of pretending to go to the bathroom, he just walks straight from his table right out the front doors of the restaurant and disappears. A couple of minutes later, Austin's mother, who was not at dinner with them, she was at her home, which happened to be nearby this restaurant. She was home when she heard the sound of someone coming into her house. So she went around to see who it was, and she found her son, Austin, in her kitchen. He was drinking vegetable oil straight from the bottle. And there was Parmesan cheese all over the counter that apparently he had been eating as well. So she runs up to him and she grabs the bottle of vegetable oil and puts it down. She tells him to stop. At which point, Austin does stop. Then, I guess Austin just went up to his room and he changed out of his clothes, perhaps because he got oil all over his shirt. And then his mom just drove him back to the restaurant. She watched him get out of the car and she watched him go through the front door, and then she drove off. So, about 30 minutes after he had left that second time, Austin walks back through the front doors of the restaurant. He's got a different shirt on, a different hat on, and he just walks to the back of the restaurant where his sister, his friend, and his father's girlfriend are, and he sits down, again, like nothing had ever happened. At first, it looks like everyone at the table is just silent. But then Austin's father very clearly said something to Austin, and it seems kind of hostile. It would turn out Austin's father, who loved his son dearly, was just totally at a loss for what to do with him. He was frustrated, scared, and confused. And he said to Austin when he sat back down, "What is wrong with you?" At this, Austin just stands up. He leans across the table and presses his father's face back up against his seat, kind of pinning him there. And then, at some point, he just lets go. He leaves the booth and he walks right out of the restaurant for a third and final time. Austin's friend, who was eating with them, he got up and kind of chased after Austin, but he was about 30 seconds behind him. So by the time he got outside, he didn't know where Austin went. He quickly came back into the restaurant and told the rest of the group he didn't know where Austin was. And so, at this point, Austin's father's girlfriend would actually call the police and report Austin missing. They knew he was totally unhinged, and they had no idea where he was going to go, if he was a threat to himself, or perhaps a threat to someone else. And so they figured they should just tell the police and have the police go find him. About 4 miles away from that restaurant, 3-year-old Michelle Mishkan was sitting in her garage watching TV. Normally, she would be joined by her husband, 9-year-old John Stevens, but he was out walking their dog. So, for the time being, Michelle was alone. The couple had been married for roughly 20 years. Between them, they had 3 children from previous marriages, and they were just totally and completely in love with each other. That garage was like their happy place. It was basically their living room. They loved having the big garage door wide open so they could wave to neighbors as they passed by and flag people down to come have a drink with them or just to chat for a while. They were known throughout the neighborhood as a very happy, loving couple that were just fun to be around. And according to their kids, they had both recently retired. John retired from his landscaping company that he owned, and Michelle retired from her job as a financial advisor. The two of them were apparently both just really excited about retirement life. They were excited to spend more time together and go out with their friends and go out fishing on their boat with their dog. and also to spend as much time as they could just lounging back in their garage. John and Michelle's neighbor, who lived directly across the street, was a middle-aged man named Jeff Fisher. Jeff was fairly close with the couple. He would usually watch their dogs for them anytime they went away on a trip, and he would often go over to their garage and have a drink and just kind of hang out with them. And so on this particular night, he was over in his house and he was planning on going to bed early. So he laid down in his bed, he's getting ready to go to sleep, when he hears some strange sounds coming from outside his window from across the street over near John and Michelle's property. So Jeff sits up in his bed and he kind of strains his ears to try to figure out what it was that he heard. And as he's trying to listen for some faint sound, he suddenly hears a blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream, coming from across the street. So Jeff instantly leapt into action. He jumped out of his bed, he ran downstairs, and he ran out his front door. And he looked across the street, and he saw this unknown man, some young man, that was slamming the car door of Michelle's car that was parked in her driveway. Then this man begins walking up the driveway. And at the top of the driveway, Jeff sees Michelle. She's standing in the garage, and she looks totally terrified. And she's facing this unknown young man. And of course, this unknown young man was Austin Harrouff. Now, Jeff had no idea what was actually going on. All he knew was that he heard this terrifying scream, which was probably Michelle, and he's looking out there and he's seeing a situation that just doesn't look right. It doesn't look good at all. And so instinctively, he decided he would just run across the street and make sure Michelle was okay. And if he had to, he would confront this unknown man, Austin. So Jeff begins running across his property, trying to get across the street to Michelle. But before he could even get all the way across the street, he's looking up and he can see this guy, Austin, has grabbed Michelle and thrown her on the ground. And now he's on top of her and he's beating her. So Jeff runs onto the driveway, and as he's going right up the driveway, between the two cars that were parked there, Austin leaps off of Michelle. He turns around and he looks directly at Jeff and he says, "You don't want a part of this." Now, Jeff, he's a pretty big guy himself. And so he's looking at Austin and he knows that if he doesn't do anything, this guy is just going to continue pummeling poor Michelle. And he had no idea where John was. So he ran up and kind of lunged at Austin. And as he did that, Austin swung and he hit Jeff right across the side of the head. But Jeff took the hit. He didn't fall down. He grabbed Austin by the collar and threw him as hard as he could to the ground. And Austin, he hit the pavement hard, face first. So Jeff is looking at this guy, kind of thinking he's not going to get up from that. But as he's assessing the situation, watching Austin start to stand back up again, Jeff suddenly feels a blinding pain in his face, in the side of his head, and his neck, on his back. He looks down, and he sees blood all over his arms. It's everywhere. He's covered in blood. It would turn out Austin was carrying a knife. And so when he had punched Jeff, that knife went into his face, it cut the side of his head, it cut his neck, and it cut his back. He had 5 different puncture points from that one single swing. And so Jeff believed in that moment that this was a potentially fatal wound. He was worried that perhaps his jugular had been struck and he was bleeding to death. And he's seeing Austin stand back up, coming right after him with this knife. And so Jeff decides their only chance is for him to run and call the police. And so he runs into Michelle's property. He's thinking that he's kind of drawing this guy towards him, away from Michelle. He runs into their property, kind of slams into all their doors. He goes out a back door, and then he loops around the property, and then he makes a run for it, straight across the street, back to his house. He never once turned around to see if this guy was after him. He just figured he was right behind him. He gets to his house, he runs inside, he locks the door, and then he calls 911. The operator asks if either of them are injured, and he says yes. There's a girl laying on the ground. He beat her up, and then he says he ran over there, and he's bleeding profusely at the moment. The operator asks if he can tell if she's conscious, and he says no, it does not appear so, and that he's been stabbed in the back and is bleeding pretty bad. After the call is placed and Jeff is certain that help is on the way, he's barely conscious. But all he can remember thinking was, I hope this maniac Austin has abandoned his attack and just run off. Or I hope John has come outside and he's helping his wife. But unfortunately, all Jeff could hear was the sound of Austin across the street making these loud, animalistic grunting sounds. And at the same time, he hears the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs. He doesn't even know if it's one person or two people, if it's male or female. All he hears is screams and grunting sounds, and then, seconds later, the police show up. The following narrative is the account of the second responding officer, who we'll just call Dan. The first responding officer we'll just call Kristen. And so Dan, he comes flying down the street, he's got his sirens on, and he pulls in right behind Kristen's cop car, which is parked right out in front of John and Michelle's property. Kristen is already running up the driveway, her gun is out, and she's getting ready to engage somebody at the top of the driveway. So Dan, he hops out of his car, he's got his hand on his gun, and as he turns to run up the driveway, his view is obscured. There are two cars parked in the driveway, and so he can't see what's at the top of the driveway that Kristen is apparently getting ready to draw her gun on. But as he begins running up the driveway, he sees there is this massive 6-foot wide stream of blood just coming down the driveway. So he goes around the left side of the left car, he goes up, and he sees Kristen right at the top of the driveway. She's got her gun aimed at the ground, right in front of the car. So he still can't see what's in front of the car yet. He comes bombing around the left side, right behind Kristen, and he looks down at what she's aiming her gun at. And he sees there's this man lying on the ground. His eyes are open. He's just laying there kind of stiff, and he's looking up at Kristen, he's looking up at Dan, and he's just quietly saying, "Please help me." The man on the ground was John Stevens. And on top of John Stevens was Austin. He was kind of laying sideways on John's chest. He had his left arm wrapped around John's neck to kind of hold him in place. And then he had his right arm, and he was doing something to John's face, but Dan couldn't really tell what he was doing. All he could take in was that there was clearly an aggressor, and they needed to get him off of the victim. But Kristen could not take the shot, because if she did, she ran the risk of firing the bullet through Austin and into John, killing John. So Dan tells Kristen, "Hold on, I'm going to tase him." And so he moves around Kristen to her left side, so he's positioned looking down at the back of Austin. He pulls out his taser. And right before he shoots his taser into Austin's back, he sees what Austin is doing to John's face with his free right hand. He was reaching into John's mouth and pulling his cheek out, kind of like a fish hook. He was pulling it out as far as he could, and then he was biting into John's cheek, and he was ripping out pieces of flesh and chewing and swallowing them. And from his position, Dan only saw this for a second, but he suddenly noticed, and Kristen, the other officer, would later confirm, there were all these chunks already missing from John's face. So Dan kind of snapped out of what he was seeing and fired his taser into the back of Austin. But it did nothing. It had absolutely no effect. Austin was entirely focused on biting John's face. That was all he was doing. He wasn't even registering that there were cops with their guns drawn on him. It was like they weren't even there. And so Dan runs back around Kristen to the other side of her. He's now on her right side, so he's standing right next to the car, looking down at Austin's front. He tells Kristen to kind of back up for a second, and then Dan winds up and kicks Austin square in the face, knocking his head off of John's face. But as soon as Austin's head comes off of John, he doesn't get up and try to fight with Dan. Instead, he just jumps back down, gets a deeper grip on John, and plunges his mouth back onto John's face. And so again, Dan winds up and boots Austin square in the face, knocking his head back. But again, he's totally unfazed. He doesn't want to attack the officers. He just wants to eat John's face. And so he goes right back down, gets a tighter grip, he goes back, and he starts chewing on John's face again. And so Dan was just repeatedly kicking him in the face over and over and over again. Right as this is happening, another set of officers showed up, and they had a canine. They had a dog. And so they come flying up, they kind of see the situation, and Dan tells them, release the dog. And so, sure enough, they release the canine. The canine clamps down on Austin's right arm, the arm that was fish hooking and kind of pulling John's face out. And the dog really got a good bite on his arm and yanked it away from John's face. But Austin just instantly ripped his arm back, doing severe damage to his own arm from the dog's teeth, and just repositioned himself and went back to biting John's face. And so the dog, just as it was trained, did another bite. It grabbed back onto Austin's arm, and it pulled it off of John's body. And so his arm is back like this again. And Austin, again, completely unfazed, just yanked his arm out of the dog's teeth again, shredding the muscles of his arm, and gets back in position and continues to eat John's face. And then finally, the dog gets another bite into Austin's arm. And this time, when the dog managed to yank Austin's arm away from John, Dan timed it so he booted Austin square in the face right as his arm was being pulled back. And he hit him hard enough that Austin actually flew off of John and landed on his back. And as soon as he was on the ground, Dan actually leapt over John and landed on Austin's face, smashing his head into the cement, which kind of stunned him for a second. And as soon as he was stunned, Dan whipped out his handcuffs, threw it over one of Austin's wrists, and began pulling him by the handcuff up the driveway away from John. But as soon as he had some separation and Dan went to put the other handcuff on Austin, Austin began fighting back. And he looked up at Dan and he screamed, "Kill me! I'm eating humans! Kill me!" Dan didn't even know what to do. And so he's trying to put the other handcuff on him, and the whole time Austin is screaming, "Kill me! Kill me!" And so other officers had to run in, and then finally, after 3 other officers came over, they were able to hold Austin down long enough to get both handcuffs on him. After Austin was finally restrained, the officers checked on the victims. They checked on Michelle, who was in the garage, and unfortunately, she was deceased. She had died from blunt force trauma. And John, even though he had been alive when the police first showed up, he had succumbed to the multitude of injuries he had sustained, from stabbings to beatings to having a portion of his face ripped off. It's believed that after John came back from his walk, which would have been right after Jeff had been attacked, and ran back to his house, John saw Austin in his garage attacking his wife, and John ran in to try to save her. So ultimately, John would die trying to save the woman that he loved. Their dog would survive the attack, it was unharmed, and was given to one of their children to take care of. And Jeff Fisher, the neighbor who tried to save John and Michelle, he would survive the attack and make a full recovery. After Austin was finally handcuffed and was lying restrained on the driveway, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, where it was determined that he had drank some poisonous chemicals, most likely from inside of John and Michelle's garage, and that was what was causing his organs to fail. Ultimately, Austin would go into a coma for 11 days from whatever he ingested. But the doctors were able to save his life, and so he would come out of that coma and he would make a full physical recovery. It was initially assumed that because of Austin's known drug abuse history, he must have been on some kind of powerful drug when he perpetrated this heinous crime. It was speculated that he could have been on bath salts or flakka, which are these synthetic hallucinogenic drugs, which are very powerful. And at the time, they were quite popular in Florida and had caused some other users to go on these kind of wild, violent rampages. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that he must have been on one of those. But when Austin's toxicology report finally came back, it showed he only had a very small amount of THC in his system, which is the drug found in marijuana. And the other drugs that were in his system were all induced by the doctors and nurses at the hospital. Which meant at the time of this horrific attack, Austin was effectively sober. When the police asked Austin, "Why did you do this?" he initially said, "I don't remember. I don't know." But eventually, he would open up and he would tell this story that no sane person could possibly understand. He said that after he left that restaurant where his family was that third time, after he fought with his father and he stormed out, after that he saw this dark figure outside with a white face, and he knew immediately that this figure was evil. And so instinctively, Austin began running away from this evil figure. And so he ran for about 4 miles into John and Michelle's neighborhood. And when he got to this neighborhood, a neighborhood he was not familiar with, that he didn't intend to go to on purpose, he just kind of wound up there. He said he saw this brightly lit up garage, and he ran up into it, believing he could enlist the help of the people inside of this house, and that they would help him defeat this evil figure that was lurking somewhere nearby. And so he runs up into this garage, which happens to be John and Michelle's garage, and Michelle is in there. John is not. He's out for the walk with his dog. And Austin approaches her and tries to get her to help him. But he probably came off looking completely insane. And Michelle screamed. At which point, Austin said he believed Michelle was a witch. And so he pulled out his knife and he attacked her. And then after she fell to the ground, Austin said he drank a bottle of alcohol or something, which we now know was most likely very poisonous lawn chemicals that was just sitting in the garage. After he drinks that bottle, he turns around and now he's looking out of the garage towards the street. And he said he saw this other figure in the doorway with a dog next to him. And then Austin said his mind just went blank. It's believed the figure he saw in the doorway was John Stevens returning from his walk. But we don't know for sure. And frankly, this story is pretty incoherent to begin with because it doesn't account for the fact that before John came back, Austin had been grappling with Jeff Fisher and stabbing Jeff Fisher, the neighbor. But Austin would say he has no recollection of encountering Jeff Fisher. He has no recollection of John or what he looked like. And he certainly doesn't remember biting John's face. And he had no memory of any interactions with police. He said that basically he turned around, he sees this figure, this dog, and then his mind went blank. And then he woke up about 2 weeks later in the hospital. Now, when his story went public, a lot of people just were not willing to accept that story. They said he was making it up so he could plead insanity at his trial and get a lesser sentence. But a world-renowned forensic psychologist named Dr. Philip Resnick, who had worked on many high-profile cases before, he did a lengthy assessment of Austin. And he came to a very different conclusion than the public. In his 3 8-page report, Resnick points out the fact that Austin continued to bite John's face even when he was being openly threatened with being shot by the police officer standing right over him. He continued to bite John's face after he was tased. He continued to bite John's face after he was kicked in the head repeatedly. He continued to bite John's face after a police dog repeatedly bit him. This all suggests that Austin was truly in a psychotic state when this attack occurred. A sane person, even under the influence of drugs, will retain a basic survival instinct. They will try to protect themselves. So when there are guns pointed at them, or they're being physically harmed, or there are threats of violence, they'll do things to protect themselves. But Austin didn't. It was like he had no idea about anything else in the world except John's face. Resnick specified that the type of psychotic episode that Austin was suffering from on the night of the attack is something called clinical lycanthropy delusions. Clinical lycanthropy is a very rare occurrence where an individual believes they are no longer human. And almost always what they believe they are is something akin to a werewolf. And in Austin's case, it's not that hard to figure out why you might reach that type of conclusion. He had told his sister earlier that day that he believed he was half horse. And then on a couple of other occasions, he had told his other friends that he believed he was half dog. And then, of course, on the night of the attack, after he killed Michelle, he pounced literally on John and began eating his face while making those loud animalistic grunting sounds. This is behavior that is certainly on par with what you would expect a werewolf to do in a movie, but this was not a movie. This was real life. After Austin came out of his coma, but before he had been transferred to jail, he agreed to do an interview with the clinical psychologist and TV personality Phil McGraw, better known as Dr. Phil. And during their 10-minute Zoom interview, Austin would break down and cry and say he was incredibly sorry to the family of the victims, that he didn't really know why it happened, and that clearly there was something wrong with him and he needed help. And he just hoped they could find it in their hearts to eventually forgive him. But it's unlikely the family of the victims are going to forgive him anytime soon. Especially when you consider they came out in an interview and said, "I hope Austin makes a full recovery from his coma, that he has no brain damage, that he is totally A-OK, so he can be fully aware and lucid when they read him his sentence." A sentence they hoped would be the death penalty. As of right now, though, the family of the victims will just have to keep on waiting, because Austin is still in jail awaiting trial. Thanks for watching. Cases like this are disturbing not just because of the violence, but because they force us to confront how terrifying the human mind can become when reality completely breaks apart. 2 innocent people lost their lives that night, a family was destroyed forever, and the questions surrounding what truly happened inside Austin Harrouff's mind still remain deeply unsettling to this day. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out our other true crime stories next. And as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Until next time.